illustration that shows the Greek and the Roman equivalents.
That would also be
in
helpful. Yeah. Some classicists get very cranky about that, actually, because they'll say, well, it's not exactly the same, but it's like, it's close enough.
Yeah.
You know? A little bit higher. Okay, is it good?
Okay, the stream's up. I just need to start the camera.
All right. So I guess it's probably Scott who texted me, because we got everybody else here. So process of elimination. Or it's just a random person texting me to say they're stuck in traffic. But that would be odd. Let's begin today with a silly poem, shall we? I memorized this when I was a little kid. I don't have it memorized anymore, so I had to look it up. But as I was prepping last night to finish our conversation on Beowulf, I remembered this poem. So I thought I would start with this. It's called On the Vanity of Earthly Greatness. The tusks which clashed in mighty brawls of mastodons are billiard balls. The sword of Charlemagne the Just is ferric oxide known as rust. The grizzly bear, whose potent hug was feared by all, is now a rug. Great Caesar's bust is on the shelf, and I don't feel so well myself. I memorized that as a kid. I wish I still had it memorized. It'd be great to pull it out at a moment's notice. Let's pray, and then we'll dive into Beowulf. Our Father, we thank you for this chance to get together on our third day of this intensive. We ask, especially this day, that you would be with us as some of us are getting tired. We ask that you would guide our conversation, give us energy, give us insight. We ask that you would be with Scott as he's in traffic right now, that you would keep him safe. We ask that you would bless all of our conversations today, cause us to see more and more of your grace to us in Christ. We ask you these things for Jesus' sake. Amen. Amen. So this morning was a kind of a rough morning for me because I was attempting to put the final touches on some of what I was hoping to say today, and my wife had left and gone to work. She's a teacher herself, and so I had my two boys for about an hour, and they decided to impersonate Grendel and Grendel's mother. We'll probably cut this out, Doug. But, so one of the things they decided to do was to build a fort and to hide in it and wait for the monster to come and attack us. This is one of their big things. And so, you know, the three of us get down into this tiny little fort, and you know, I'm sitting there thinking, like, I should be preparing for my class. And you know, my son Andrew will imitate the monster, so make these, you know, very loud roaring noises. He's almost 5, and then my almost 3-year-old Jack will be sitting there and just shaking because he's convinced that a monster is coming. You know, it's real to him. They've both been told the story of Beowulf, and it's interesting what they glean from that story. They have heard it from me a number of times in obviously a very abridged form. The dragon plays a prominent role. And one of the things that they gather from it is that good knights and good soldiers share, and dragons don't share. And so they've told me the story back, and it's a very condensed form of Andrew and Jack are 2 knights, and they're very good because they share with each other. But there's a dragon, and he won't share. You know, that's like Beowulf in a nutshell. So I've thought at different times of doing like one of those, you know, 30-second YouTube summaries, and I would probably just say, good knights share, bad knights and dragons don't share. But there is some truth to that, is there not? I mean, we talked about this at the end of class yesterday in our conversations, because there's a sense in which the good king is the ring giver. He is the one who shares the loot, shares the treasure with his men. And the dragon is the anti-good king. The dragon we picture sprawled across a barrow of treasure, hoarding all of it for himself. And so we have this sense in which, when we said that epics talk about heroes, Becca mentioned yesterday, you know, that often these heroes are these people who are kind of acting from the heart. They're acting very, very forcefully. We have kind of the anti-hero in the dragon. We have the anti-hero in the monster. And so we kind of as we think through these different elements of epic, you know, that an epic contains heroes, but it also contains villains or anti-heroes. It contains monsters and dragons. Beowulf really sets that out beautifully for us, does it not? So let's open our book, and what I'm going to do quickly before we pick up where we left off yesterday is I'm going to show you what Anglo-Saxon would have sounded like, because I think I would rather an expert do it than me try to butcher it. Abe, you actually did a wonderful job yesterday. I think you got way closer than I would have. But I was looking last night for an example of Tolkien reading Beowulf. I was convinced that I had one, but I can't seem to find it. But there is a professor at the University of Virginia who's recorded a great deal of it. And so turn in your book just to the opening lines, and I'll let you kind of follow along as you listen to a few passages. So I'm just going to let you hear, starting in the passage that in our English begins, "So the spear gains in days gone by," so you see at the very beginning. But if you look over on the left, you'll see it written out in the Old English. So if you like, just take a minute and listen to what this would have sounded like. It's quite beautiful. And again, it's better to have an expert do it for us than someone like me. Can you kind of follow along? You can hear it, right? It's cool, isn't it? So that's something like what it would have originally sounded like. We've talked quite a bit about epic often being something that is sung or recited rather than simply read. And the sounds of these words are often really important. Yesterday we talked about the fact that Beowulf is full of compound words, so two words that are essentially smashed together, sometimes called kennings. Let me give you a few kennings that we find, or a few compound words that we do find in Beowulf. And I'll ask you, Becca, in a minute. You mentioned something about a Tolkien translation, I think, that has a bunch of these. So if you want to tell everyone just a word or two about that, because that's also a good resource for you if you're more interested in books that will have more of these, in translations that will have more of these kennings, or these compound words. But an example from Beowulf would be battle sweat for blood, okay? A breaker of rings for a chieftain, sleep of the sword for death. These are kind of compelling, aren't they? Mind's worth, talking about honor. Here are some other just Anglo-Saxon compound words that I think kind of feed into this. The weather of weapons, talking about war. A wound hoe, talking about a sword. The breaker of trees, talking about wind. So, I mean, you have this whole kind of panoply of compound words. And I think, Becca, you had said yesterday, you had mentioned to me that Tolkien has a translation, which I haven't read, but it's also quite beautiful. Is that right?
Yeah, it preserves a lot more of the kennings than the Seamus Heaney, but it's not quite as readable. So if you really like words, just in their own right, then take some time with the Tolkien, because you end up, when you read the whole thing a lot, you start thinking in these compound words when you're walking around your life, which is a little bizarre.
Yeah, your poor spouse is going to be like, why are you, speaking to me and describing it as opening your word hoard?
Yeah,
just tell me what you think. Don't open your word hoard. I mean, that is literally the description of how a character begins to speak. If you look at page 19, starting at line 268, the leader of the troop unlocked his word hoard. the distinguished one, delivered this answer. Beautiful description, isn't it? I've known a few people with vast word hoards. Sometimes you want them to shut the word hoard. But in any event, so shut your word hoard. That's a much politer way of saying shut up, isn't it? If we could close the word hoard. The problem with those kind of insults is invariably the person you're insulting doesn't have a clue what you're talking about, and so a lot of it is lost on them. But yeah, thank you. I think you'll finish this class. You'll spend a few weeks recovering, watching a lot of TV, and then you'll be like, man, I want more of that. And then you go and you get the Tolkien translation, and you'll find all sorts of beauty there that we don't see in Haney. I really like Seamus Heaney as a poet, and I recommend sometime, and I'll recommend some poems to you of his if you like. But look him up sometime and read some of his own poetry. Many of his poems are quite beautiful in their own right. So let's kind of carry on with Beowulf, picking up where we left off yesterday, and just to briefly summarize, everything was as it should be. Hrothgar has built this mead hall. There is feasting, there is joy. Hrothgar is a good king. He's a ring giver. He shares, to put it in the terms of my two young sons, he shares his treasure. But now something in the marshes, okay, something on the outskirts of civilization has heard that joy, and it invokes rage in this monster named Grendel. We talked about Grendel being kind of the embodiment of evil. Grendel is outside of civilization. Grendel is untamed. And Grendel is kind of the quintessential epic monster. It's a nightmare monster. So turn with me to page 11. And we find this description of the way things are now that Grendel has come into the mead hall and begun eating Hrothgar's men. So Grendel ruled in defiance of right, all the way at the bottom of the page, one against all until the greatest house in the world stood empty, a deserted wallstead. For 12 winters, seasons of woe, the Lord of the Shielding suffered under his load of sorrow. Skip down, line 165 or thereabout. So Grendel waged his lonely war, inflicting constant cruelties on the people, atrocious hurt. He took over Heorot, haunted the glittering hall after dark, but the throne itself, the treasure seat, he was kept from approaching. He was the Lord's outcast. These were hard times, heartbreaking for the Prince of the Shieldings. Powerful counselors, the highest in the land, would lend advice, plotting how best the bold defenders might resist and beat off sudden attacks. Sometimes at pagan shrines they vowed offerings to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid and save the people. That was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts they remembered hell. Okay, we're going to talk about this a little bit, but remember I said that there's a big debate in Beowulf scholarship in terms of whether this is a Christian work, a Christian epic, with some memories of paganism, or whether it's a pagan epic with Christian themes kind of laid on top of it. This is one of the passages that often gets used. We mentioned this obliquely yesterday, but here we see it explicitly, okay? So sometimes at pagan shrines, they vowed offerings to idols, swore oaths that the killer of souls might come to their aid and save the people. If you believe that this was a pagan work that, let's say, a Christian priest fell in love with but decided to Christianize, then the next section would be an addition, okay? This is something that this priest wrote in. Okay, that was their way, their heathenish hope. Deep in their hearts, they remembered hell. Okay, kind of like when I tell my sons a story and somebody gets killed in it, and I say, no, Andrew, you do not kill your brother. That's not okay. You have to kind of clarify. It's almost like the priest has to step in and do that, or this is just a Christian work that is remembering an earlier time, and it is preaching a little bit, but that was the original. Okay? Will we ever really fully know? Probably not. Okay? Remember, we have one manuscript of this that was almost burned itself. Deep in their hearts they remembered hell, the almighty judge of good deeds and bad, the Lord God, head of the heavens and high king of the world, was unknown to them. Oh, cursed is he who in time of trouble has to thrust his soul in the fire's embrace, forfeiting hell. He has nowhere to turn. But blessed is he who after death can approach the Lord and find friendship in the Father's embrace. Just out of curiosity, does anybody have an opinion on that passage? Does that feel to you like a sermon that was added on to that? Or does it feel organic? Does it feel like it was originally there? Again, we won't know this, so this is the kind of thing you can have strong opinions on because we won't know whether you're right or wrong. So why not? What do you think? What do you think, Becca?
I don't know, I've like had conflict on this because I think sometimes it can feel like references to God are just they're just replacing something that's something like fate.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is one of the most difficult ones to kind of suss out in terms of, because there is a lot of it that looks like it could just have been added later, but the way that it starts and progresses does seem rather organic. So.
It's kind of like what my sons do with songs these days, where they've decided that there are certain words, like but, that are really funny. And so they sing a song now, and every third word now is but. So they've just taken a particular word out, and they've replaced it with but, you know? It's especially hard when you're hearing them sing this like wonderful praise song they learned in their chapel, and you've got but every 3 words. That's kind of a crass summary of something that like what might be happening here, but it's almost as if at points a later editor or redactor might have taken this work and said, every time Odin is mentioned, we'll just say the Almighty. Every time, does that make sense? Every time a pagan god or deity, we'll replace that. But this is controversial. This is problematic. If you know that, you know what you need to know. If you don't care, that's okay. You don't have to. So that troubled time continued, woe that never stopped, steady affliction for Halfdane's son. Too hard an ordeal, there was panic after dark. People endured raids in the night, riven by the terror. When he heard about Grendel, Higelac-Thane was on home ground over in Geatland. Who is this? It's going to be Beowulf, right? There was no one else like him alive. In his day, he was the mightiest man on earth, high-born and powerful. He ordered a boat that would ply the waves. Ply the waves is a great phrase, isn't it? Ply the waves. He announced his plan to sail the Swan's Road and search out that king, the famous prince who needed defenders. Nobody tried to keep him from going. No elder denied him, dear as he was to them. Okay? Instead, they inspected omens and spurred his ambition to go. Also on the paganism versus Christianity thing, but I'll just skip over that. You guys don't seem that worried about that. Turn to page 19, and Beowulf and his men will enter into the hall of Hrothgar. So get the setup here. Okay, things were the way they were supposed to be. Then there was this massive devastation of Grendel, of the mead hall, and now the hero comes and introduces himself. Okay, so he's asked to introduce himself, and on the middle of page 19, he does by unlocking his word hoard. The leader of the troop unlocked his word hoard. The distinguished one delivered this answer. We belong by birth to the Geat people and owe allegiance, and so on. Okay, and he introduces himself. So here is the person who is going to be the hope for Hrothgar and Hrothgar's men. He's going to announce his name on page 25. There's a lot in a name, isn't there? Names at this time will often mean things, as they often have through history. And a name is also important because people will recognize it and they'll say, oh, that we've heard stories of you. If you're a hero, when that name is said, then hopefully people will recognize who you are. Okay? If you ever meet a narcissist, they always introduce themselves like this. You know, hey, I'm John. You heard of me? No. Okay, they think they're heroes. Okay, Beowulf is a hero, and here on page 25 he introduces himself. The man whose name was known for courage. You see it there? His name is known for courage. The Geat leader, resolute in his helmet. Man, that's a great description. Helmets are important. Hector's flashing helmet, remember? I mean, it's a piece of armor, but he's resolute in his helmet. Answered in return. We are retainers from Higelac's band. Beowulf is my name. If your lord and master, the most renowned son of Halfdane, will hear me out and graciously allow me to greet him in person, I am ready and willing to report my errand. And what is he there to do? He's there to kill Grendel, right? To set things to right. So there's a lot that's going to take place in a passage we're going to skip here, but in essence, the setup is going to be that Beowulf and some of his men will sit in the hall, and they will wait for Grendel to come back. This is tremendous bravery on his part, because there's been a great deal of bloodshed from Grendel's ravages in the past. Look at the top of page 47, a note of just how brave Beowulf is. Top of page 47, if you do have a different translation, which I don't think anyone in the room has a different one, but it's about 675, line 675. Beowulf says, "When it comes to fighting, I count myself as dangerous any day as Grendel." That's a bold boast, isn't it? I showed you the picture of Grendel, one rendering of it, and we were all a little bit scared. I mean, Beowulf says, who is this Grendel? I'm about as scary as Grendel. So it won't be a cutting edge I'll wield to mow him down, easily as I might. He has no idea of the arts of war, of shield or sword play, although he does possess a wild strength. No weapons, therefore, for either this night. Unarmed he shall face me, if face me he dares, and may the divine Lord in his wisdom grant the glory of victory to whichever side he sees fit. Now, Beowulf is refusing to fight Grendel with weapons. I mean, what do you glean from that? I mean, what's going on there? There are a bunch of different possibilities. What do you think, Abe?
I put, when I was reading through this, I don't know if it is or not, but it could be like an allusion to David.
Yeah, it feels a bit like that, doesn't it?
But, you know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mentioned to you yesterday that one of the reasons why we sometimes miss Christian themes in this is that we as Christians are often much more familiar with the New Testament than the Old Testament. The author or authors of Beowulf are profoundly influenced by Old Testament themes. We saw that, of course, Grendel is supposed to be a spawn of Cain. Maybe there's a hint to David here, you know, in terms of going out against Goliath and refusing the king's armor. What else might be going on here? What do you think?
It sounds a little bit like the one-on-one battles.
Yeah, doesn't it?
From the epic that seems to be repeated over and over and over.
Yeah, it is.
And all the array on both sides, but then in the final analysis, it's hand-to-hand combat.
It comes down to hand-to-hand combat. And there's a sense in which it's almost as if Beowulf is saying, well, Grendel won't have a sword. I mean, that's an interesting point, right?
It's almost like a nobility, that, an impartiality, I'm going to be equal.
Yep. You know, there's a beautiful, almost futility to that kind of statement. There's this wonderful story from World War II about a very small group of British soldiers called the Red Devils that were fighting during a battle called the Battle of the Bulge. And at one point, this very small group of Red Devils are trapped in a basement cellar, and they're surrounded by all these Germans. And at one point, apparently, one of the German leaders decides, well, we'll parley, we'll see if they want to talk about surrender. So he sends forward one of his men with a white flag, and apparently, as the story goes, one of the British Red Devils yells out, "No, we won't let you surrender. We can't fit all of you down here." I mean, it's that like nobility of, you know, you're about to die, but you're, you know, yelling back. And Beowulf is this proud hero who seems to be saying, I don't need a sword, you know, because Grendel won't have a sword. I don't want an advantage. Turn to page 49, and if I were Beowulf, I would have started regretting my decision very quickly here, but page 49 at the top, so line 710, in off the moors, down through the mist bands, God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. The bane of the race of men roamed forth, hunting for a prey in the high hall. Under the cloud murk he moved towards it until it shone above him, a sheer keep of fortified gold. Nor was that the first time he had scouted the grounds of Hrothgar's dwelling, although never in his life before or since did he find harder fortune or hall defenders. Obviously, you've got a kenning there, the hall defenders, but you also have a foreshadowing of what's to come. This is very, very common. We've seen it many times already in the epics we've read. That if you're listening to this, okay, and you're wondering, well, what's going to happen with Grendel? Well, he's going to face a stiff resistance. You know, this is a common thing in a recited epic to tell your audience a bit of what's going to happen, but it also builds the anticipation. Spurned and joyless, he journeyed on ahead and arrived at the bawn. The iron brace door turned on its hinge when his hands touched it. Then his rage boiled over. He ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood, pacing the length of the patterned floor with his loathsome tread, while a baleful light, flame more than light, flared from his eyes. He saw many men in the mansion, sleeping, a ranked companion of kinsmen and warriors quartered together, and his glee was demonic, picturing the mayhem. Before morning, he would rip life from limb and devour them, feed on their flesh, but his fate that night was due to change. His days of ravening had come to an end. Mighty and canny, Higelaic's kinsman was keenly watching for the first move the monster would make. Nor did the creature keep him waiting, but struck suddenly and started in. He grabbed and mauled a man on his bench, bit into his bone lappings, bolted down his blood, and gorged on him in lumps, leaving the body utterly lifeless, eaten up hand and foot. We won't always dwell on the blood and gore, but there's a fair bit here. This poor friend of Beowulf's here is what's often called the expendable crewman. If you watched Star Wars, for instance, there's always somebody getting hit before the hero. Did you want to say something? Okay. Venturing closer, his talon was raised to attack Beowulf where he lay on the bed. He was bearing in with the open claw when the alert hero's comeback and arm lock forestalled him utterly. The captain of evil discovered himself in a hand grip harder than anything he had ever encountered in any man on the face of the earth. Every bone in his body quailed and recoiled, but he could not escape. He was desperate to flee to his den and hide with the devil's litter, for in all his days he had never been clamped or cornered like this. So, in essence, what the action is showing us here is that Grendel has come in, has eaten one of Beowulf's men, and then comes over to Beowulf, who's pretending to be asleep, essentially. He reaches out, and Beowulf grabs hold of Grendel's arm, okay, and holds onto the arm, and we're told, it's a grip that he had never felt before, that Grendel had never felt before. So firm a grip that Grendel wants to flee, but can't. Personal question. When you read the story of this battle, was there any point where you ever felt any pity for Grendel? It's a real question. It's not a rhetorical question. I'm not expecting you just to say no. No?
No. Maybe a bit.
A little bit? This is our film guy, though. You always want, you want a little more nuance, right? Anybody else?
No, I can see that. I'm trying to think through what I was thinking when I read this, but I just thought it was just very funny. It's kind of exaggerated,
It is exaggerated. It certainly is. There's always debate about this. If you go back to a book which we didn't read, but that is also a very important epic, the epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's a scene in Gilgamesh where Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu go into a forest to slay a forest monster, and there's always been a question in my mind as to how sorry we should feel for the forest monster at the very end, named Huwawa or Hubaba. I don't know. I sometimes do. It depends on the mood I'm in, I guess. What about you, Becca? Did you feel any pity for Grendel?
I always feel pity for Grendel's mother.
Yes. Well, this is going to be the great thing, of course, because as soon as we kill the monster, then we get the monster's mother. It just never ends.
And
So
Huwawa and Hubaba, whichever one you go with,
Yeah.
he isn't out ravaging, so he is more pitiable.
He's more pitiful.
Just sitting there in his
Mhm.
forest, guarding the cedars of Lebanon.
Yep. Where Grendel's actually in somebody else's house.
Stand your ground, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. We're in Florida. We're crying out loud. We won't go there. That's been one of the joys of moving back to Florida from Scotland. It's just a very different culture. In Scotland, if somebody's furious with you, they will give you a dirty look. They'll be like, and you're supposed to take that, and interpret that. Where here, you don't know. You don't know what that person has in their truck. Right after we got back, I pulled my hero stunt. We just moved back to Florida, and I was pumping gas. My sons call it petrol because we were in the UK. We were pumping gas at a gas station, and I'm standing there pumping the gas, and my older son Andrew wanted to come help, so he comes out and he's helping, and there's somebody who pulls up behind us, and it's crowded, of course, and he's getting angrier and angrier that I'm letting my son pump the gas, and so he just starts laying on the horn, And so I put Andrew back in the car, and I'm like, I'm going to be a hero. So I stormed back. I told him if he blew the horn again, I was going to go into the store and buy everything in the store, one item at a time. I got back into the car, and I was like, that's the moment when I should have been shot. Like, it's right there, And my wife turns to me, and she says, what are you doing? She's like, you haven't even gotten life insurance on yourself yet, Well, that's a good point. So we'll probably cut that out, Doug. What did you say, Scott?
It's good to know her priority.
That's right. It was a very practical, very wise question, actually. Back to Beowulf. I don't usually find myself feeling a tremendous amount of pity for Grendel at this point. Okay, Grendel's gotten caught. Grendel wants to flee, but Grendel can't. And there's sort of this, oh no, you don't feeling here, where Beowulf has got hold of Grendel's arm and is not going to let Grendel escape. Now, Beowulf kills Grendel, but how does Beowulf kill Grendel? I mean, there's a slaying of the monster, but it's an interesting slaying. What happens?
He doesn't kill him right here.
No, he pulls off Grendel's arm,
Yeah.
essentially. Okay, and Grendel flees without his arm. And there's an assumption that Grendel is going to go down and die in the marshes, but there's no clear, definitive slaying of Grendel. He's grabbed hold of his arm, he's holding on to his arm, and when Grendel is defeated, he runs away without his arm. Okay. Now, what do they do with the arm?
They hang it over
Yeah.
hang it on the wall.
Yeah. I mean, you do what a hero in this time does. If you got a head or you got an arm or whatever, you post it up so everybody can see it. Going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, another very ancient epic that's written long before this, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu do kill that forest monster, they build a gate, essentially, for a city out of the remains of that monster so everyone can see. The problem with that kind of boast, though, is it's almost like waving a flag, isn't it? And it's going to wave a flag for Grendel's mother. They don't probably know that Grendel has a mother, but if Grendel's mother is looking for the mead hall that killed her son, it's kind of like that one with the arm hanging off of it. But again, these are warriors. These aren't philosophers and thinkers.
It's one of those things where it shows you that the world hasn't changed very much, because Mussolini and his girlfriend were hung upside down.
They were.
When they were caught by the partisans and so forth.
Yep.
It was like a trophy, the Beowulf trophy.
We often make a mistake reading something like Beowulf, and this will be true for the Song of Roland as well, and thinking like, how does this relate to my life? I'm telling you the story about talking to the guy at the gas station, right? What you really need to be thinking about is, what would Assad's Syria right now look like? It has a just brutality to it that is much more analogous to Syria, where if you betray the regime, you are tortured, you are killed, you are hung up, as an example. There's just a cruelty and brutality to it that I think we can miss sometimes if we're thinking, well, if I were in a McDonald's parking lot and somebody, well, no, that's not really what it looked like. There's a cruelty and brutality here. So let's look at just the reference to the arm being hung up and a description of Hrothgar giving thanks to Beowulf. So look with me at page 63. Just right before that, one line from the prior page, when Hrothgar arrived at the hall, he spoke, standing on the steps under the steep eaves, gazing at the roofwork and Grendel's talon. This is a beautiful setup. So he's going to give thanks, but he's like walking in and he's kind of looking up like, whoa, wow, good job. First and foremost, let the Almighty Father be thanked for this sight. I suffered a long harrowing by Grendel, but the heavenly shepherd can work his wonders always and everywhere. Not long since, it seemed I would never be granted the slightest solace or relief from any of my burdens. The best of houses glittered and reeked and ran with blood. This one worry outweighed all others, a constant distress to counselors entrusted with defending the people's forts from assaults by monsters and demons. But now a man with the Lord's assistance has accomplished something none of us could manage before now for all our efforts. Whoever she was who brought forth this flower of manhood, if she is still alive, that woman can say that in her labor the Lord of ages bestowed a grace on her. So now, Beowulf, I adopt you in my heart as a dear son. Nourish and maintain this new connection, you noblest of men. There will be nothing you'll want for, no worldly goods that won't be yours. I have often honored smaller achievements, recognized warriors not nearly as worthy. I picture a couple of them standing there like, hey. Lavished rewards on the less deserving, but you have made yourself immortal by your glorious action. May the God of ages continue to keep and requite you well. You have made yourself immortal by your glorious action. There is a very strong epic theme, is there not? We've talked about this many times now. The immortality that is attained by the doing of glorious deeds. Now, just when you think that everything is going to get back to the way it should be, Grendel's mother shows up. Again, if she's looking for the mead hall to avenge herself at, it's very easy to find. It's the one with the Grendel's arm hanging off of. So right there, that's the one we're going to go to. And turn with me to page 89. After much feasting and rejoicing and singing, they have gone to sleep in the mead hall, and as we will learn at the end of this passage, Beowulf is elsewhere. Okay, so the hero has come in, he has swooped in, he has saved the day, and now the hero has left, and we're going to get part 2, round 2, Grendel's mother. So top of the page, they went to sleep, and one paid dearly for his night's ease, as it happened to them often, ever since Grendel occupied the gold hall, committing evil until the end came, death after his crimes. Then it became clear, obvious to everyone once the fight was over, that an avenger lurked and was still alive, grimly biding time. Grendel's mother, monstrous hell bride. Hell bride, isn't that great? Don't ever use that as an insult, by the way, but it's good on the page. Brooded on her wrong. She had been forced down into fearful waters, the cold depths after Cain had killed his father's son, felled his own brother with a sword, branded an outlaw, marked by having murdered, he moved into the wilds, shunned company and joy. And from Cain there sprang misbegotten spirits, among them Grendel, the banished and accursed, due to come to grips with that watcher inherit, waiting to do battle. The monster wrenched and wrestled with him, but Beowulf was mindful in his mighty strength, the wondrous gifts God had showered on him. And then it goes on and tells you how Beowulf killed Grendel. Then skipping down at the bottom of the page, she came to Herit. There inside the wall, Danes lay asleep, earls who would soon endure a great reversal once Grendel's mother attacked and entered. Her onslaught was less only by as much as an Amazon warrior's strength is less than an armed man's when the hefted sword, its hammered edge and gleaming blades slathered in blood, raises the sturdy boar ridge off a helmet. Now this isn't exactly a simile, but it's a kind of beautiful description, is it not? Epics often have these very ornate descriptions. If you think of the difference between just a sheer clean helmet and a helmet that has horsehair or ornamentation on it, that's the difference between saying Grendel's mother attacked and it was just about as bad as her son, and her onslaught was less only by as much as an Amazon warrior's strength is less than an armed man's when the hefted sword, its hammered edge and gleaming blade slathered in blood, raises the sturdy boar ridge off a helmet. It's highly ornate. It's very descriptive, and the listener kind of nods and maybe smiles. Good one. Then in the hall, hard-honed stones were grabbed from the bench, many a broad shield lifted and embraced. There was little thought of helmets or woven mail when they woke in terror. The hell dam was in panic, desperate to get out, in mortal terror, the moment she was found. She had pounced and taken one of the retainers in a tight hold, then headed for the fen. To Hrothgar, this man was the most beloved of the friends he trusted between the two seas. She had done away with a great warrior, ambushed him at rest. Beowulf was elsewhere. Okay? So this is allowed to happen because Beowulf has left. They think that things are going back to normal, but they have not. We've got the mother now to deal with. So Hrothgar laments this. There's much mourning, and Beowulf is sent for again and asked to deal with Grendel's mother. If you were more a contemplative person, you can kind of picture him being like, oh man, again, like I thought I fixed that. I tend to think he was like, okay, I was getting a little bored, Page 103, we're going to find Beowulf doing the thing that no man who is a contemplative sort of man would ever do, just diving into a dark lake looking for a monster. There are often different types of people in the world. Hrothgar strikes me as someone who's very happy to have other people dive into the dark lake. I can even see this between my two sons. So my older son is very much a hero. He thinks of himself as a hero. His favorite line right now is, "I'm going to be famous." Went to the beach the other day, he was surfing, and every time he caught a wave, he'd say, "Am I famous now?" Well, not quite. I mean, to me you are. But he wants to do great deeds. His younger brother, Jack, is very happy to kind of watch and direct, you know? And I can kind of picture if there were a war of some kind, Jack would be very good at planning the cause of action, and Andrew would be very good at diving into it. Beowulf dives. Okay, he doesn't stop and think, he dives. And at the bottom of page 103, he's going to dive into a lake after Grendel's mother. Never a good idea, but it works out for him, so hey. After these words, the prince of the Weathergeats was impatient to be away and plunged suddenly, without more ado. That's such a great description, isn't it? After these words, he's impatient, and he dives without more ado. It's like, enough of the speech making, enough of the talking, let's just get on with killing Grendel's mother. He dived into the heaving depths of the lake. It was the best part of a day before he could see the solid bottom. Wow. Quickly the one who haunted those waters, who had scavenged and gone her gluttonous rounds for 100 reasons, sensed a human observing her outlandish lair from above. So she lunged and clutched and managed to catch him in her brutal grip. But his body, for all that, remained unscathed. The mesh of the chainmail saved him on the outside. Did you mention, Abe, yesterday that you noted this passage about the chainmail?
Yeah, like Mithril.
Yeah, kind of like in Lord of the Rings or in The Hobbit, there's a tremendous amount of description of the chainmail that they're wearing. Her savage talons failed to rip the web of his war shirt. Great description of chainmail, by the way, war shirt. Then once she touched the bottom, that wolfish swimmer carried the ring-mailed prince to her court, so that for all his courage he could never use the weapons he carried. And a bewildering horde came at him from the depths, droves of sea beasts who attacked with tusks and tore at his chainmail in a ghastly onslaught. The gallant man could see he had entered some hellish turnhole, and yet the water did not work against him, because the hull roofing held off the force of the current. Then he saw firelight, a gleam and a flare-up, a glimmer of brightness. The hero observed that swamp thing from hell, the Tarn hag in all her terrible strength, then heaved his war sword and swung his arm. The decorated blade came down ringing and singing on her head. But he soon found his battle torch extinguished. The shining blade refused to bite. It spared her and failed the man in his need. We'll stop there for a minute, and we're going to finish this off in a moment here. But this is a really interesting thing that someone like Tolkien will pick up on as well, where when you go down into these dark places, you dive into a dark lake, there's a sense in which it's almost an endless passage. I mean, you're going down, 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 down further, and it turns out that there's way more there than you would have thought. And down, lurking in the depths, are all of these just absolutely terrifying creatures, these monsters of all sorts. It's a very common thing in this period, which often gets labeled the Dark Ages, to think of the dispelling of older superstitions and older myths and older stories as like expelling them from civilization and sending them off to hide somewhere. And so it's almost like Beowulf, in diving down into this, is going into this place where all these terrible things have retreated and now lived. Does that make sense? They lurked there. So here Beowulf is attempting to fight Grendel's mother with his bare hands. That's not working very well. Page 107 at the bottom. Then he saw a blade that boded well, a sword in her armory, an ancient heirloom from the days of the giants, an ideal weapon, one that any warrior would envy. But so huge and heavy of itself, only Beowulf could wield it in a battle. This is a really, really common idea in the medieval period. You're nodding, Jose. I mean, the sword, often the sword gets named.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I was nodding about is I was thinking, this is like Deus Ex Machina, right? Where just... Yeah. I mean, it just seems like sometimes, like, when
it's analogous to that.
Right, when we're reading the Iliad, and then,
like
Aphrodite just takes Paris away.
Yeah.
or just saves the hero. It just kind of seems like that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a out of the blue kind of thing. Yeah, so it isn't exactly a divine intervention necessarily, but it is wrestling. Oh, what's that? Oh, it's a giant sword. The only sword that can kill this monster.
Yeah, that term is used a lot nowadays when you're like with script writing.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the moment where something appears that saves a hero out of nowhere.
So how does it match up for someone who does film? I mean, is it compelling? Is it?
I think because it's such an old tale, like I think we can give it a pass.
This is how very condescending of you. There's ancient epics like this have for lack of a better word, almost a childishness to them, and I don't mean that in a condescending way, but the way that children tell stories is very action based, and you can often have something which just all of a sudden takes the story in a completely different direction. I mean, it's how my sons tell stories. Once upon a time we were knights. We had adventures. Also, there was a dragon. We killed the dragon. Then we had ice cream. It's like these things don't necessarily follow a completely linear pattern. So you have to make your own decisions on that. But you are right that it's almost as if he's struggling. Oh, there's a sword. It's the only sword that can kill this monster. I'm the only person in the world that can wield this sword. He grabs it. So it is a kind of out of the blue. So the top of the page of 109. So the Shielding's hero, hard pressed and enraged, took a firm hold of the hilt and swung the blade in an arc, a resolute blow that bit deep into her neck bone and severed it entirely, toppling the doomed house of her flesh. She fell to the floor. The sword dripped blood. The swordsman was elated. He then goes down and finds Grendel, who is dead, and does what you'd expect him to do, which is cuts off Grendel's head. This beheading of a monster, I mean, you think obviously of David beheading Goliath here, but it's also just a common motif. You gotta show the head to show that you actually killed the thing. Grendel's arm is great, but the head is really important. This is just really, really common in the ancient world. It's common in the medieval period. You've heard of Vikings and ancient people like that who would say drink out of the skull of an opponent and that sort of thing. I mean, you keep the head. You got to show that this is the person that you say you killed. Because maybe you just killed a tiny monster down there, right? You need the head so you can kind of show how amazing you were. Now, one or two you mentioned. Yeah.
I just have a question.
Please.
So, isn't Deus Ex Machina, Machina, isn't that a literary device that we use now that isn't necessarily by a god?
It isn't. I suppose if you were, let's say you were reviewing a book for like the New York Review of Books or something, and you felt like there was a really phony plot twist, where all of a sudden, halfway through the book, we found out that this person wasn't who they said they were, or something like that, but it hadn't been well developed. You might criticize it as a clumsy Deus Ex Machina or something like that. It's sort of you as the author have now swooped down and rescued your story, or you've taken it in a completely different. So you're right. It has that connotation, especially now.
Yeah, because I know, maybe not etymologically, but just as far as the word the Deus, it doesn't really carry over today. We just call it that.
Yep.
But I think that's a really good observation because it does really seem like that. The author comes down and pretty much just swoops down and says, "Okay, I'm going to enter this thing and rescue the story." So it does seem that there's not a god behind it, but just talking as like a literary device, as we would call it.
Yeah.
I think that it seems like that. That was just maybe.
And he gets impatient with long speeches. He's ready to dive. So these things at their best, these epics at their best, will often just rush at you. It's kind of like an army charging at you. You have to act. You have to pay attention. And so 6 more pages of description of Beowulf grappling with Grendel's mother might bore people, but if we've got a big sword there, now we've got their attention again. And some of this is speculative, but that's how I kind of interpret it. You've got to keep the action going. Now, 1 or 2 of you said that you felt pity for Grendel's mom. You said you feel a little pity for her. I do too, I suppose. Why do you pity Grendel's mother?
I mean, she isn't the most sympathetic character.
You have a hard case to defend her, I suppose.
Yeah. She doesn't seem to be ravaging over, she's kind of made her place in her little sits quietly and maybe terrorizes the underworld a little bit. Which, who cares?
And she only steals one of the men and takes him back. So there's a sense in which it's almost a proportionate retaliation. You know, I stole one of theirs, they stole one of mine.
I think that she might be driven kind of out of duty, just as like a mother. So we're not going to fault her for trying to get back her child. Yeah. And yet she now faces Beowulf. You know, so there is a sense where she's not really, I guess, culpable for this because it's her mother. It's her nature to go out and seek revenge for her children.
Yes. Yeah. Other thoughts on that? We're gonna see Hrothgar's warning to Beowulf now. So let's turn to page 119. Everyone is now rejoicing. If you think of Monty Python, and there was much rejoicing, that's what we have here. There was much rejoicing. Page 119, Hrothgar begins to speak, and he says, "It is a great wonder how Almighty God in his magnificence," do you see in the middle of the page there? "It is a great wonder how Almighty God in his magnificence favors our race with rank and scope and the gift of wisdom. His sway is wide. Sometimes he allows the mind of a man of distinguished birth to follow its bent, grants him fulfillment and felicity on earth, and forts to command in his own country. He permits him to lord it in many lands until the man in his unthinkingness forgets that it will ever end for him. He indulges his desires. Illness and old age mean nothing to him. His mind is untroubled by envy or malice or the thoughts of enemies with their hate-honed swords. The whole world conforms to his will. He is kept from the worst until an element of overweening enters him and takes hold, while the sold's guard at sentry drowses, grown too distracted. A killer stalks him, an archer who draws a deadly bow. And then the man is hit in the heart. The arrow flies beneath his defenses. The devious promptings of the demon start. His old possessions seem paltry to him now. He covets and resents, dishonors custom and bestows no gold. And because of good things that the heavenly powers gave him in the past, he ignores the shape of things to come. Then finally the end arrives, when the body he was lent collapses and falls, prey to its death. Ancestral possessions and the goods he hoarded are inherited by another who lets them go with a liberal hand." You hear all sorts of themes that I'm sure that you guys could go preach on Sunday, couldn't you? And this is brilliant. You get good fortune, especially in your youth, and you think that it's because of you rather than the Almighty. Then you get greedy, and you want more. You forget that you will die. And it's a powerful message, isn't it? Yeah.
Reflective of the book of Ecclesiastes.
Sure. Yeah, and it's reflective of ancient wisdom as well. I mentioned to you in the discussion yesterday about Hannibal speaking to Scipio right before Hannibal's last battle. My Latin students and I translated this about 2 weeks ago. It's a beautiful passage where Hannibal, the old general, speaks to Scipio, and he says, you think, Scipio, that because you're young and fortune has always favored you, that it always will. But you don't know how the world works. I was young once. I thought fortune always favored me, but it isn't now. Things have turned. And the young man's mistake is to assume that fortune will always be with you. And Hrothgar is speaking to Beowulf as a younger warrior and saying, don't get puffed up with pride. Don't think that these things are your own. They are gifts to you. You see this phrase of the body he was lent collapses and falls. Now, the very practical message here concerns this ideal of kingship, which means a good king shares. A good king gives parts of the loot to his men. And one of the things that Hrothgar is warning Beowulf about is getting puffed up and thinking that he should own everything, that he should refuse to distribute the wealth. So let's go on. O flower of warriors, beware of that trap. Choose, dear Beowulf, the better part, eternal rewards. Do not give way to pride. For a brief while your strength is in bloom, but it fades quickly, and soon there will follow illness or the sword to lay you low, or sudden fire or surge of water, or jabbing blade or javelin from the air, or repellent age. Your piercing eye will dim and darken, and death will arrive, dear warrior, to sweep you away. Just so I ruled the Ring-Danes' country for 50 years, defended them in wartime with spear and sword against constant assaults by many tribes. I came to believe my enemies had faded from the face of the earth. Still, what happened was a hard reversal from bliss to grief. Grendel struck, and lying in wait, he laid waste to the land, and from that moment my mind was in dread of his depredations. So I praise God in his heavenly glory that I live to behold this head dripping blood, and that after much harrowing I can look upon it in triumph at last. Take your place then with pride and pleasure and move to the feast. Tomorrow morning our treasure will be shared and showered upon you. The Geat, Beowulf, was elated and gladly obeyed the old man's bidding. He sat on the bench, and soon all was restored, the same as before. Happiness came back, the hall was thronged, and a banquet set forth. Black night fell and covered them in darkness. That last bit is beautiful, isn't it? Things are restored. We are feasting again. The expendable crewmen are, just very expendable to us at this point. We're not grieving over them, they're just gone. All those guys that got eaten. And things are, again, the way that they're supposed to be. And everyone lives happily ever after. Nope. I want you to find it. But when you read the Tolkien article that I recommended to you yesterday, the paper called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, he has this wonderful discussion of Beowulf, all of which ends until the dragon comes. That's his last line, until the dragon comes. The dragon comes. Beowulf takes power. He reigns for many, many years. He marries a queen. He is rich and successful. But then a dragon invades his kingdom. And the dragon is going to attempt to destroy the peace and prosperity of Beowulf's kingdom, just like Grendel and Grendel's mother destroyed the peace and prosperity of Hrothgar's kingdom. We've gone for an hour. Let's pause there. I'll give you a chance to get some of Lori's snacks, which are upstairs. So you want to take about a 10-minute break. We'll get some snacks. We'll come back to the dragon and finish Beowulf, and then we'll dive into the Song of Roland. See you in a bit.
Is there any comparison to Beowulf and Samson?
Oh, I think all the Old Testament heroes like that are very comparable. Samson, I think of some others. The book of Judges is full of heroes like that who slay monsters.
I just thought about the superhuman strength
Yep.
of Samson and Beowulf. I just didn't know how much was made of it.
I don't know. Dependence is really, I'll just say this, dependence is really hard to demonstrate. Unless an author says, I'm thinking of Samson here, it's almost impossible. But yeah, are there hints of it? Absolutely, I think so. It's just hard to know exactly how much this author would have had in front of him when he's writing this. So, yep. It's a good question. All right, great. Just noticed as I was sitting here getting ready to pick up my book that on the very, very front page, one of the descriptions, the recommendations of this book, and this translation in particular, is that it's as visceral as a nightmare. I think it's pretty fair description of what we've got in front of us. It is visceral like a nightmare. So as we said, things don't just go on happily ever after. Instead, a dragon invades, and at the very end of Beowulf's life, after reigning for 50 years, he is now required to go out and fight the dragon. Here we have on page 171, towards the end of this entire epic, we see Beowulf going out again into single combat, leaving his men and going to fight the dragon. There's a sense in which this is going to be his last battle, and you get a sense that he kind of knows that. He's old now, but he's going to go fight one more time. Top of the page, he addresses his men, so beginning with "then he addressed," do you see that towards the top? "Then he addressed each dear companion one final time, those fighters in their helmets, resolute and highborn. I would rather not use a weapon if I knew another way to grapple with the dragon and make good my boast as I did against Grendel in days gone by. But I shall be meeting molten venom in the fire he breathes, so I go forth in mail shirt and shield. I won't shift a foot when I meet the cave guard. What occurs on the wall between the two of us will turn out as fate. Overseer of men decides. I am resolved. I scorn further words against this sky-born foe. Men-at-arms, remain here on the barrow, safe in your armor, to see which one of us is better in the end at bearing wounds in a deadly fray. This fight is not yours, nor is it up to any man except me to measure his strength against the monster, or to prove his worth. I shall win the gold by my courage, or else mortal combat, doom of battle, will bear your lord away." Then he drew himself up beside his shield, the fabled warrior in his war shirt and helmet, trusted in his own strength entirely, and went under the crag. Now, he's left his men. This is a scene of single combat. They're going to watch, right? I mean, this is the scene that we've seen over and over and over again. There's a very long description of the battle. We're going to skip to some key bits. So page 175, speaking of the dragon towards the top of the page, we read, "The mound keeper," talking about the dragon, "went into a spasm and spouted deadly flames when he felt the stroke. Battle fire billowed and spewed." The stroke is of Beowulf's sword, so Beowulf is striking him with his sword. "Beowulf was foiled of a glorious victory. The glittering sword, infallible before that day, failed when he unsheathed it, as it never should have. For the son of Ictho, it was no easy thing to have to give ground like that and go unwillingly to inhabit another home in a place beyond. So every man must yield the leasehold of his days. Before long, the fierce contenders clashed again. The horde guard took heart and hailed and swelled up and got a new wind. He who had once ruled was furled in fire and had to face the worst. No help or backing was to be had then from his high-born comrades. That hand-picked troop broke ranks and ran for their lives to the safety of the wood. But within one heart, sorrow welled up, and a man of worth, the claims of kinship, cannot be denied. His name was Wiglaf." Now, Wiglaf is a wonderful character to end the story of Beowulf with, isn't he? Who is Wiglaf? What does he do? He's one of this troop, hand-picked troop of Beowulf, who doesn't turn and run. He actually seeks to aid Beowulf as Beowulf's companion. Turn the page and we read about Wiglaf, line 26-25. "And now the youth was to enter the line of battle with his lord, his first time to be tested as a fighter. His spirit did not break, and the ancestral blade would keep its edge, as the dragon discovered as soon as they came together in the combat. Sad at heart, addressing his companions, Wiglaf spoke wise and fluent words. I remember that time when mead was flowing, how we pledged loyalty to our lord in the hall, promised our ring-giver we would be worth our price, make good the gift of the war gear, those swords and helmets as and when his need required it. He picked us out from the army deliberately, honored us and judged us fit for this action. made me these lavish gifts, and all because he considered us the best of his arms-bearing thanes. And now, although he wanted this challenge to be one he'd face by himself alone, the shepherd of our land, a man unequaled in the quest for glory and a name for daring, now the day has come when this Lord we serve needs sound men to give him their support. Let us go to him, help our leader through the hot flame and dread of the fire. As God is my witness, I would rather my body were robed in the same burning blaze as my gold giver's body than go back home bearing arms. It's a brilliant speech, isn't it? I told you, I think the phrase in Latin that's supposed to have been stated by many Spartan mothers and wives when they sent their husbands off to war. Did I mention this to you already? The Latin phrase, aut cum scudo, aut in scudo. Did I mention this? Does it sound familiar? So either with your shield or on your shield is what a Spartan mother is supposed to have told her son when he went off to battle. You come back being born on your shield, or you come back carrying it. You come back being carrying your shield, or you come back being carried on your shield. Okay, you don't come back without the shield. You don't throw that shield and run away. That's the idea. So either with the shield, having defeated the enemy, or on the shield, having been killed. There's no in between. Wiglaf is giving that kind of honorable speech to the men. This is a continuation in Scandinavian culture of a theme that we're going to see then again in the Song of Roland, which is that kings have noble, loyal lords or thanes who surround them. They're often hand-picked for their bravery. And Wiglaf is speaking to these men, and he's saying, look, Beowulf has chosen us. He hand-picked us. He asked us to be his companions. The Roman word for this was the comitatus, the companions of the emperor or the general. They are the comitatus. They are the companions. And he says, we were picked for our bravery, and now we're running. What's going on with this? Yeah, Beowulf said he would take care of this himself, but Beowulf needs help. Wiglaf turns out to be the only one who ends up going into battle with his king. Page 183. Top of the page. Once again, the king gathered his strength and drew a stabbing knife he carried on his belt, sharpened for battle. He stuck it deep into the dragon's flank. Beowulf dealt it a deadly wound. They had killed the enemy. Courage quelled his life. That pair of kinsmen, partners in nobility, had destroyed the foe. So every man should act, be at hand when needed. But now, for the king, this would be the last of his many labors and triumphs in the world. Then the wound dealt by the ground burner earlier began to scald and swell. Right, so Beowulf in the combat has been wounded by the dragon, and there is poison that is now in his body. Okay? Beowulf discovered deadly poison suppurating inside him, surges of nausea, and so in his wisdom, the prince realized his state and struggled toward a seat on the rampart. He steadied his gaze on those gigantic stones, saw how the earthwork was braced with arches built over columns, and now that thane unequaled for goodness, with his own hands washed his lord's wounds, swabbed the weary prince with water, bathed him clean, unbuckled his helmet. Beowulf spoke in spite of his wounds. Mortal wounds he still spoke, for he well knew his days in the world had been lived, and out to the end, his allotted time was drawing to a close. Death was very near. And so Beowulf gives a speech in which he tells Wiglaf that he would have wanted to bestow his armor on a son if he had had a son, but instead he will bestow it on Wiglaf, who has earned his spurs, if you will. He's won his spurs. He's shown himself to be brave and noble. And Wiglaf then leaves Beowulf, goes into the dragon's lair, and comes out with treasure. Okay? Now, if you're not picking up on Tolkienian themes, to coin a phrase, you're missing a lot here. I mean, Wiglaf is this kind of hero who goes into the dragon's lair and comes out with treasure. Is he not? I mean, we're gonna see that in The Hobbit and themes like that in Lord of the Rings as well. Turn the page to 189. At the bottom, we read Beowulf's last words. He asks for a barrow, a tomb of sorts to be constructed for him. Line 2809, towards the bottom. Then the king in his great-heartedness unclasped the collar of gold from his neck, and gave it to the young thane, gave it to Wiglaf, telling him to use it, and the war shirt and the gilded helmet well. You were the last of us, the only one left of the Wegmundings. Fate swept us away, sent my whole brave, high-born clan to their final doom. Now I must follow them. That was the warrior's last word. So there's a funeral, and the funeral is bitterly sad, because everyone who buries Beowulf now knows that their hero is dead. And the next monster who comes, and the next enemy at the gate, there will not be a Beowulf to fight them. Wiglaf is still learning. He's still young. They need a great warrior. Look at the description of Beowulf in his death and what the people say. Page 203, about line 3008. We must hurry now to take a last look at the king and launch him, lord and lavisher of rings, on the funeral road. His royal pyre will melt no small amount of gold, heaped there in the hoard. It was bought at heavy cost. And that pile of rings he paid for at the end with his own life will go up with the flame, be furled in fire. Treasure no follower will wear in his memory, nor lovely woman link and attach as a torque around her neck. But often, repeatedly in the path of exile, they shall walk bereft, bowed under woe, now that their leader's laugh is silenced, high spirits quenched. Many a spear, down cold to the touch, will be taken down and waved on high. The swept harp won't waken warriors, but the raven winging darkly over the doomed will have news, tidings for the eagle of how he hooked and ate, how the wolf and he made short work of the dead. This is gloomy, isn't it? This is, the warrior is now dead, and with him dies much of our hope for the future. This is the death of Hector, in a sense. And the two are probably not necessarily reliant on each other, but this is a theme in epic that we talk not just about foundings, but of falls, and of great falls. And with the death of Beowulf, also dies much of the hope of his people. Final lines that we'll read together here come from page 211, in the middle of the page. The Geat people built a pyre for Beowulf, stacked and decked it until it stood foursquare, hung with helmets, heavy war shields, and shining armor, just as he had ordered. Then his warriors laid him in the middle of it, mourning a lord far famed and beloved. On a height they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Wind died down and flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. They were disconsolate and wailed aloud for their lord's decease. By the way, bone house is a really, really fascinating term for a tomb of sorts. Now, they're being burned here, but it's a bone house, a hot bone house. A Geat woman, too, sang out in grief. With hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears. A wild litany of nightmare and lament. Her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. If you're not hearing echoes here of the death of Hector, you're missing a lot. Heaven swallowed the smoke. Then the Geat people began to construct a mound on a headland, high and imposing, a marker that warriors could see from far away, and in 10 days they had done the work. It was their hero's memorial. What remained from the fire they housed inside it, behind a wall, as worthy of him as their workmanship could make it. And they buried torques in the barrow, and jewels, and a trove of such things as trespassing men had once dared to drag from the hoard. They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure, gold under gravel, gone to earth, as useless to men now as it ever was. Then 12 warriors rode round the tomb, chieftain sons, champions in battle, all of them distraught, chanting in dirges, mourning his loss as a man and a king. They extolled his heroic nature and exploits, and gave thanks for his greatness, which was the proper thing, for a man should praise a prince whom he holds dear and cherish his memory when that moment comes when he has to be conveyed from his bodily home. So the Geat people, his hearth companions, sorrowed for the lord who had been laid low. They said that of all the kings upon the earth, he was the man most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame. There you go. So what do you think? Beowulf. Love it? Hate it?
I like it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Where do you see Beowulf fitting in terms of the epics we've read so far? So we read the Iliad, we've read the Aeneid now. We've mentioned other epics, but this is kind of the next epic that we're now just concluding. It's the first epic that we're going to look at that takes place during the Middle Ages and what we would think of as kind of a Christian period. What do you think of it? I mean, in comparison to the other two, how does it rank against the Iliad and the Aeneid for you? Yeah,
I would say it is less grand or epic even, in that its scale isn't like the Iliad or the Aeneid, where they're traveling and finding different creatures and different kind of journeys and prophecies and that.
Yeah.
This is a small area that it takes place in, and so there's that difference there that I see.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment actually, because when you think of both the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we didn't read the Odyssey, but if you think of the Iliad and the Odyssey, we're talking about essentially the world is hanging in the balance. You know, the Greeks, the authorities of the West have gone to war with the Trojans in the East. When Odysseus in the Odyssey is traveling back, he's all over the place in the Mediterranean. This is a really narrow area by comparison. You know, if you think of the Aeneid, Aeneas is leaving Troy, he goes all the way down to Carthage, he travels many other places, but ultimately goes up to found Rome. There's a great distance traveled there. Here again, we're talking about the distance between the southern part of Sweden and probably modern day Denmark, that kind of small region. So there's more of a local feel to it, isn't there? That's very true. Yeah, what else?
It seems to me like it's more of a character study.
Huh.
I mean, even just the title Beowulf. I don't know the Aeneid, talking about Aeneas, but I mean, there's so many more characters in that. Like you can see Dido, and you can see just a couple other people, and the Iliad is all over the place. Like this one just kind of seems to focus on Beowulf a lot, and again, serves like a character study, and like everything everyone does will eventually come back to Beowulf. Like, you know, Wiglaf, we have him at the end, not really, we don't explore him too much because he's kind of relating everything he's doing to Beowulf. So it kind of just seems like it's more about an epic hero than an epic, again, journey, because I think it just kind of describes important parts of his life.
Yeah, I like the comment, because I think it carries forward what Abe was saying as well. You know, Abe is saying geographically it's more limited in scope, but there's a sense in which, in terms of the characters, this is slightly more limited. There's a really kind of narrow focus on Beowulf, and then the people around him who make Beowulf Beowulf. Hrothgar plays a prominent role, but he plays a prominent role as somebody who kind of anoints Beowulf as the hero, you know? So we're seeing a very, very powerful central character, and we're watching the development of his character. That's really good. What did you think, Scott?
Just with it being, is it fair to say it's an epic tragedy?
Yeah, I think it does have a really tragic kind of trajectory, doesn't it, to some extent?
With the Aeneid, it feels like there's a sense of hope. A brand new nation has been formed. Whereas with here, it's like we're just ending hopeless. Like the greatest king that has ever lived and will probably ever live is now gone.
Yeah, we won't get another one like this.
Yeah, and so it just ends on such a very sad note, where I felt like with the others, there's at least with the Aeneid, there's a sense of hope and greatness to come outside of Aeneas, whereas with Beowulf, it's, well, it was a good time, we had a great run.
We had a good run.
Tragedy will continue to come our way.
Yeah. One of the things that's very popular in the Middle Ages, and we will just brush up against it in this class, we won't address it at length, but if you think of something like the Arthur legend, which is very popular in the Middle Ages, kind of partakes of that same paradigm of there once was a time when we had a good king and justice was properly distributed, but he's gone now. In Arthur's case, it's not clear if he actually died. Perhaps he's off in a place called Avalon and he might come back. But there's a sense that there once was a time when things were the way they were supposed to be, and with the departure of that king, things have fallen apart. And we kind of get that premonition in Beowulf, don't we? That here was Beowulf, who was a good ring giver. He won fame, and he shared the credit, if you will. He shared the treasure. Now he's dead, and what's going to happen to us all? And it's a sad note. It's a down note that it ends on. I'll show you if I can find it when we come back after our next break, a short clip taken from Lord of the Rings that models very closely this burial of a king and a woman lamenting for the king. So it's very likely that Tolkien has these things in his mind. Tolkien would be the first to resent the idea that he was just rewriting something like Beowulf. He thought he was doing his own thing to a great extent, and that's true. But these themes are present, unquestionably. Other thoughts on Beowulf? Any of its themes or ideas? Go ahead.
Do you think that him sending in, is it Wiglaf? Into get some of the gold?
Mm-hmm.
That's like kind of an anticipation of what is to come.
Sure.
When the dragon's dead, and even if Beowulf is dead, the treasure's down there now, and it's time for the whole place to go and get the loot. So it seems that it's maybe not a sad ending, and it's just like now the treasure's there, and the monster's gone.
Yeah, the hope at the end of Beowulf, to the extent that there is any, is in Wiglaf. And I think you see that, a gesture towards that, in the fact that Beowulf, as he's dying, is sending Wiglaf in to get the treasure. It's also reflective of Beowulf's character, that he's the kind of king who will share the treasure with others. You know, so he's sending Wiglaf in to get it. Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah. Did you want to finish that?
I was just going to say, what I noticed that was different than the previous epics was the god and gods.
Yeah.
It seems like this is kind of not dualistic, but there's the Almighty, and then there's this spawn of Satan.
Yeah.
You know, this. So before we talk about all these goddesses, and here it's just like there's one, and there's something that's like the embodiment of evil, but it's not like he's in rank with God himself.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think when we think of this as something of a hinge into the age of Christendom, the medieval period, I mean, one of the things, and we talked about this last night in our discussion as well, but one of the things that we're seeing here is this sense that we have moved from a whole pantheon of deities, some of whom are favoring one side, some of whom are favoring another, they're fickle to some extent, to a sense that there is good and evil in the world. There is one God who's in charge of all, and we as his followers are tasked with fighting evil. You know, I mean, it's simplified the world to some extent. We don't have to worry about appeasing all these various deities. You know, if I misstep, will I offend that God who will send a plague? There isn't that kind of sense driving any of the action in Beowulf, at least as I read it. Did anyone else want to follow up on that point? Because I think that's an interesting point. I mean, it's an interesting shift from a pagan worldview in which there are many gods to something that's closer to a Christian perspective. Other thoughts on any of that? Yeah.
I mean, maybe this is way too specific, and maybe I'm missing.
No.
But back on page 13,
I
think it's lines 165 to 169.
Okay.
But it just said, so Grendel waged his lonely war, inflicting constant cruelties on the people. Atrocious hurt he took over. Here it haunted the glittering halls after dark, but the throne itself, the treasure seat, he was kept from approaching. He was the Lord's outcast. Is he the monotheistic God's outcast? Is it referring to the Lord as the king of that area that kicked him out?
It's God's outcast, I think.
So that it's an allusion to him being Satan?
Being
cast out of
I think I think it's more an allusion to the fact that he's a descendant of Cain, that he's been sent away. I think.
I just didn't know. I didn't know what he was being. This throne, like, is it in the hall itself?
Yes. Yes.
It seemed highly specific to the throne in the mead hall that he's being kept from. But why?
Picture Grendel having come into a giant mead hall, and he's thrown over the benches, and he's eaten a bunch of the men. But at the front of the mead hall, perhaps where the large fire would be. This is true, like even if you go into castles in the UK, you know, you get this giant hall, and then there's a big fire at the end with a giant chair of some kind, and the king sits up there. I think all it's saying is he came in there, he wrecked the whole place, but he wasn't able to sit in that chair because he's the Lord's outcast. He's been sent away. Why, I don't exactly know. It's kind of a mystical bit there. You know, like he's being, like somehow he can't sit on that chair. I don't exactly know why, but it's interesting.
No,
It's an interesting point to bring up, though. There's a clear sense that evil is inferior to God. There are not multiple gods, some of whom are doing good and some of whom are doing evil, and they're in this competition for each other. There is God who is in control of everything. There is us, right, under him. And then there are forces of evil who are down here, as opposed to good and evil being battled up at the top. I think that that's pretty clear. And I do think that that marks a bit of a shift in terms of how we see the epic genre developing as it becomes Christian in the West. There's that real notable shift. Do you have any comments on that, Jim?
It seemed to me, this kind of based on what Scott was talking about a while ago. At the end of the first one, we have the death of Hector, and the end and the hopelessness of Troy. So Troy is, in that world, is gone. But then we have the hope of a new world. We have the hope of Rome.
The end of the Aeneid.
So it's at the end. So there's a sense you have the founding, as it were, of Greece and Troy, and then they in effect almost destroy each other. But then you have the founding of some new thing, some new hope, and I was struck by the fact that it seemed to me that we were just left with hopelessness with Beowulf, although you just mentioned that maybe there is a hint of hope with the young man who
with Wiglaf.
So maybe that's what I was looking for. I didn't pick up on him as being the hope.
The hope in Wiglaf is that the mantle is being passed, essentially. The giving of the armor, Beowulf giving his armor to Wiglaf, is in a sense anointing Wiglaf as his son and to some extent as his successor. He's saying to people, here's someone who's as brave as me, you should follow him. And I do think there is some hope in that. There's a sense that not everyone fled. Right? All of Beowulf's hand-picked men fled, except for Wiglaf. And it's Wiglaf who gets the armor. And so there is a great deal of hopelessness at the end, but it's not complete. There is this little bit of hope shining in. Which is that
with the son thing, it's almost like an echo of Julius Caesar that in effect adopts Octavian. What is it? Octavian? Octavius.
Who becomes Augustus.
And so then he then provides the new hope for in effect, I think you said, or somebody mentioned that it's almost like a third founding of Rome, that it has the initial founding, and then there is a second level there, and then Augustus.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that Wiglaf seems to almost earn his sonship. He's one of the picked men, but it's in the moment of battle that Beowulf says, you are like a son to me because you've actually shown yourself to be more brave and more honorable than all these other men. It's a really brilliant work, isn't it? I mean, it's a gripping story. It doesn't always have all of the nuance of say a modern work of fiction, perhaps. These characters aren't highly contemplative most of the time. They act. Beowulf certainly is somebody who just dives into combat. But there's a really strong sense of honor, a really strong sense of duty that we see here. And some remarkable insight into the values of this culture. What makes a good king? A king is good if he shares. He wins honor, but he's winning honor not just for himself, but for his people. Final thoughts on any of that? We're going to make a bit of a transition here. We'll do a Deus Ex Machina and rush over to the Song of Roland in a minute here. But any final thoughts? Yeah.
Have you? I'm sure you have. Maybe.
Maybe not. You don't know.
Brothers Grimm.
Yes.
It kind of strikes me like something that I would find there, just like with the idea of the monsters.
Oh, sure.
So I don't know, like going back to the pagan thing.
Yeah.
Just the idea that it's like so, I don't know. I don't know if the Grimm brothers were like maybe inspired by Beowulf, or and I know they put a lot of tales that they already knew just into writing.
Yeah, I think if you think of something like Grimm's fairy tales, the fairy tales in Germany especially that are compiled by the Brothers Grimm, they're putting together and compiling, and it's debated to this day how much they actually add or subtract to these stories themselves, but they're telling narratives in these fairy tales that often include monsters. So it tells you that there's something very primal in a story, and especially in a good story, that there's a monster there. Neil Gaiman, if you are familiar with that name, a contemporary storyteller, talks about the purpose of fairy tales. And one of the things that he says is that the purpose of a fairy tale isn't to tell children that they're monsters. It's to tell children that monsters can be beaten. Your kids know that there are monsters. They know that there's evil in the world. They quickly pick up on that. But a fairy tale says that evil isn't the final answer, that the monster can be defeated, that the dragon can be defeated. If you think of these kind of stories as teaching you things that you didn't know, you're missing a lot. A lot of times they're tapping into things that you always knew, and they're telling you about those things that just come very naturally to you. You already think in these categories, and they're unfolding that for you in a dramatic way. So I think to your point, if you do study fairy tales, you will find monster after monster after monster, because I think, and dragon after dragon after dragon, because I think that's just a part of how we think. We tend to personify evil. That's a really good comment, though. Any other thoughts or questions?
I was thinking last night driving home that and this is kind of what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
I had never thought in terms of, the Little Red Riding Hood.
Yeah.
The Three Pigs.
Yep.
The Goldilocks and the Bears. Mm-hmm. Almost all of those are basically echoes of Beowulf, it seems to me.
Oh, sure. There are loads and loads of echoes like that. I mean, medieval European fairy tales are traveling in these models constantly. You'll see this more as we unfold further classes in the program, but when we talk about comedy, for instance, how comedy is ultimately a Cinderella story, that Cinderella fairy tale. Tragedy is often seen in certain gestures in fairy tales, but most dominantly the genre of comedy is just there in the fairy tale. So these are just, if you believe Aristotle, okay, and you don't have to, but if you believe Aristotle, these genres are not things that we impose on literature. They're just there in good literature. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, we don't have to take a piece of literature and kind of press like a cookie cutter, a tragic or a comic or an epic or a lyric genre onto it. We look at it and it just seems to naturally unfold in certain ways that allow us to see, oh, this is an epic, or this is a comedy, or this is a tragedy, or this is lyric, And I think that's one of the things that's just really satisfying about thinking in those categories, because you don't have to press it down on things. They just naturally kind of rise up out of the text itself, out of the story. So, any final thoughts before we start introducing Roland?
Do you think one of the morals is just about like pride, and that he got the first monster, he got the second monster, and the third one?
Got him?
He didn't want to use his army, he didn't want to use any weapons, and that's the one he dies on.
Maybe. There's also a sense, though, in which he is now at the end of his reign. He's reigned for 50 years, and there's something fitting about dying at the hands of a dragon, who you've also defeated, because he brings down the dragon at the end. So, yes, I think there's a lesson in it, but I think the lesson is also just how fitting that you've got 3. 3 is a good number. If you're thinking of this as a Christian epic, 3 is very important, right? There's also, though, I think, just carrying that forward a bit, there is a lesson when it comes to pride, and it really goes to Hrothgar's speech that we read kind of in the middle of the epic, where he warns Beowulf about don't think that because you're young and you have all your strength that it'll always be that way. And I think that's the lesson. And you do see that in the fact that he finally dies at the hand of the dragon, right? He can't keep this going forever.
At his old age.
Yeah, in his old age, but he can't keep it going forever, and none of us can. And there's that line in Hrothgar's speech that you will forget that you will die, right? I'm paraphrasing it, but pride does something to us that tells us, you're not going to die. You won't go the path of all flesh. You will be the one person who lives forever. And it puts out of our minds the need to cultivate relationships, to cultivate friendships. It says, I'm a legend in my own eyes. I'm an island to myself, and I don't need these things. And what Hrothgar is saying is, no, remember, you too will die. It's probably a legend, but you've heard the story, of course, of how Romans gave triumphs to their generals. That when a general returned from battle and was paraded through the streets of Rome in his chariot, and as he had all the garlands being thrown at him by the people and everyone cheered, the legend at least is that there would be a slave standing next to the general whispering into his ear, remember, you too will die. Now the joke is that Julius Caesar, when he had his triumph, was deaf in one of his ears. And perhaps that was the ear the slave was whispering into. But remember, you too will die. It's what keeps you humble. It's what breaks Achilles' rage. See, when he sees an old man begging for the body of his son, he remembers that he too will die. He remembers when he thinks of his father in his old age, that his time is coming to an end. And it levels everyone to a great extent. The hierarchies exist and often are enforced due to the fact that we forget that this person I'm reporting to, like me, will also die. And what that reminds us is that he or she is also human. You know, when I started working in a firm, the attorneys I was working for looked to me like gods. You know, they wore these expensive clothes. They were much older than me. They drove expensive cars, and you naturally fall into this tendency to assume that this person who is in power over me is like a god, but they're not. Why? Because at the end of the day, we are all on the same playing field when it comes to the Grim Reaper. We will all die, and I think that's one of the things that epic literature can teach us. And I think it's certainly one of the things that Beowulf teaches us.
There's a great scene towards the end of the movie, Patton, where he talks about that.
Does he? Huh.
Yeah, he of course he's glorifying war
yes,
at the end of his life.
Uh-huh.
And he tells the story about Rome and the victor coming in with the slaves walking in front and all the trophies being thrown, and then he talks about the slave that's whispering in the general's ear.
I didn't know that that's recounted in Patton. I need to go watch that movie again. I haven't seen that in forever. It's a wonderful movie. Patton is an epic hero.
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely. That will, in fact, for future reference, that might very well be a clip that you would show. I would. When you talk about that very thing. I love that. I mean, it's a great scene. Yeah. I love that. That would be a great thing to just get to the end of Beowulf and then cut to Patton talking about that. That'd be wonderful. But Patton is kind of the exemplar of that kind of hero in modern terms. Yeah, he's larger than life. He's a throwback. Yeah. The whole thing with the honor, he slaps the young guy and gets fired because of it, and so he's functioning like Beowulf, and Eisenhower's listening to a different drummer. He's listening to a new world. One of the things I think we also learn from this, and I'll say this as a practical note that you guys can take or leave. Some of you will have more experience than I do in terms of management of other people and dealing with other people. Some of you will have less. But just take this for what it's worth. When you have people who have this personality, who either work with you or for you, it's helpful to understand what motivates them. It's helpful to think of, say, Priam, who goes to Achilles and doesn't yell at him and tell him he's wrong, but instead appeals to his honor.
when you see Beowulf and even his interactions with Wiglaf, I mean, ultimately what this type of person is motivated by is an appeal to honor. It's an appeal not to go do that thing because it's the thing that will work. It's not a practical kind of appeal. It's a very honor-based appeal. You didn't have to tell Beowulf that he would be sure to win for him to dive into that dark lake to hunt down Grendel's mother. But what you do have to tell him is that he'll win honor, and people will sing about him. And so there is a type of personality which mirrors this heroic, epic personality, this epic hero's personality. And that personality can be very, very effective, but sent the wrong direction can also be very dangerous. And so the way to motivate this kind of person is to make an appeal to honor. Think of, as I mentioned when we were talking about the Iliad, the Apostle Paul appealing to Philemon. Okay, that is an honor-based appeal. I could tell you to do this, but I'm not going to. I'm asking you because I'm Paul, a man in chains, an old man in chains. That is an honor-based kind of appeal.
Another spin on that type of personality is that you get two of them, and you got problems. I mean, I can remember, and I'm sure you can identify with this when you're picking a jury.
Oh yeah.
Or you want to be sure you don't have two of these people, because you want to, in the process of picking a jury, you're identifying who's going to be the foreman, who's going to run the show, and you don't want another person that's going to be like that, because whatever that foreman decides, the other guy is going to go the other way. So then you're dead in the water.
It's helpful, it's taking it even beyond picking a jury. I mean, picking a jury is the prime example of that. That's exactly right. Thinking about establishing a team, multiple heroes on a team are going to be problematic. And if you're not that personality, you probably don't want 2 or 3 of those on your team. If you are that personality, you may not want any of them on your team, depending on. Again, this is very practical, so take it or leave it. But you're getting in epic literature beyond just the joy of learning these motifs and learning these patterns in literature. You're getting an insight, I think, into the human soul to a very great degree. And you're seeing exemplars of a certain type of personality, this hero. Along with the monsters and villains, we're also seeing the exemplars of heroes. And so it may be helpful to you down the road as you encounter these things. I've had a number of negotiations in my life where I have thought to myself, this person is much more like Achilles than not. The appeal that I need to make is an appeal that's made to Achilles. So next time I ask for a raise from Knox, I'm going to try to figure out who I'm asking and if he's an Achilles.
Who you're talking to.
Exactly. That is a joke. If you're watching this, Dr. Rayner.
So would it be valid to divide the soul into 3 parts?
Sure.
And there's a timocrat, which is run on honor.
Yeah.
And there's aristocrat, which is run on wealth.
Yeah.
And that might be more of the appetitive.
Yeah.
And then you could appeal to, I guess, the philosopher who's run on truth, which is the noetic. So would that, maybe most people fall into those 3 categories, either the appetitive, the spirited, or, there you go. So people are motivated in these 3 ways, which we can categorize them. We know what drives them.
So one of the things that Sam is kind of mentioning here that might be helpful to those of you who aren't already in the program and going through the program is that something that was very important for the Greeks that actually comes from Plato largely is the notion that the soul can actually be divided up into 3 parts. The rational, which for Plato was often seen as the most elevated and the most noble, the spirited, and the appetitive. Okay, so the rational is essentially the thinking part of the soul, the part that philosophizes, that contemplates. The spirited is the part of the soul that acts, and especially acts out of honor. Has a strong sense of duty, has a strong sense of honor, nobility. And then finally we have the lowest part of the soul, which is the appetitive. Now, there are Greek words for these, but I think rational, spirited, and appetitive kind of makes the most sense. What we are seeing over and over and over in epics is the triumph of the spirited. Okay, the person whose soul is predominantly spirited is often an epic hero. That's why Beowulf isn't standing over the dark lake and wondering, what kind of disease am I going to catch if I die? I mean, they didn't know about disease, of course, but you get my point. He's not contemplating that. He's thinking, when will I win honor? How can I get on with this? For people like Plato, they would have said that the philosopher is the person who is dominantly rational. The warrior, the noble, an aristocrat often, is very spirited. And to use the Greek term, the hoi polloi, the people, hoi polloi, meaning the people, those who are at the kind of the bottom of society, sometimes called the demos, the people, the voter in Athens, is most often appetitive. Appetitive is exactly what you imagine it to be, driven by physical senses. What do I have right in front of my nose right now, and especially if it's something to eat or drink, or an appeal to something like sex or sensuality, those are the kind of things that I'm going to act on. One of the things I think that we're seeing over and over in these epics is that the epic hero is driven by honor and driven by this spirited part of the soul. I'm not here to teach you psychology. You know, if you take issue with this, that's fine. But just know that there's this basic tripartite division of the soul that comes from Plato that's very influential in a lot of interpretations of these kinds of works. And it often works, as you just kind of think about it just in a practical way. Is this person primarily a thinker, driven by logic and reason? Is this person primarily spirited, driven by honor? Or is this person appetitive, driven by the base instincts? This is what Becca Meaner the other day was mentioning when she talked about a lot of heroes being driven by the heart, being spirited. So is that helpful to think through that as you look at some of these characters? Hopefully it is. It's then helpful on a practical level when you make an appeal too. Okay? Am I talking to somebody who's going to be motivated by the facts? Do I need to print out a spreadsheet and show how rationally this makes sense? Okay? If you're in a department, okay, you're reorganizing a program. I know, Jose, you teach at Calvary, right? So let's say you're going to a supervisor at Calvary and trying to get something done. The person you're appealing to there, you're going to want to know, is this person driven by facts? Is this person driven by honor or base instincts? I'm sure at Calvary there's nobody in this category, right? But these categories are helpful for that kind of thing, just at a very basic level. Thoughts? Yeah.
Song of Roland.
Yeah.
It seems like there's one character that's probably a little bit more platonic in the sense that he's more rational. It's
at least by comparison.
Oliver, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Oliver.
So he's kind of like, hey, let's ask for some help, and then Roland is like spirited. He's like, heck no, let's fight.
Oliver keeps saying, sound the Oliphant.
But then
right? Blow the trumpet.
Right, and then it kind of maybe appeals, it kind of ends up appealing to the rational at some point, because then Roland is like, yeah, maybe we should have asked for help.
What you'll often find, and again, I'm not a psychologist, so this is not pop psychology, but just a very practical comment here. What you will often find is that you have to give a lot of thought to what kind of person you are. And then you have to, at all costs, avoid the mistake of assuming that everybody else is just like you. Okay? Let's say you're a very rational person. You run on facts. Someone comes to you and makes an appeal that's based on facts. You respond. The desperately terrible error to make is to assume that everyone you interact with will respond the same way. Okay? Because then you end up talking past people. So you have somebody who's a very honor-driven person. They don't want to do the thing that makes the most sense in terms of dollars and cents or the statistics. They want to do the thing that will earn credit for either them, for their organization, that it will be seen as a success, it will be seen as an honor to them or the people they work with. You know, if you go to them with this factual appeal, a very rational appeal, you'll often be talking past them. So this is just a helpful kind of practical tip. Take it for what it's worth. Yeah.
I know we want you to move on.
No, it's okay.
This is one of the funny things about Achilles, is that he actually wanted to be done with war because he knew that honor kind of goes away. So he was going to stop fighting, and that's where who's the leader?
Agamemnon.
Agamemnon wanted to come get him back. So I don't know. It's just we would normally think about Achilles being spirited, but he actually stops fighting. He wants to go back because I think that he knows that kind of honor that he's.
Yeah, well, he knows that he's been dishonored. I mean, that's a very big thing, because for Achilles in the Iliad, when his war bride is taken away from him, he has been dishonored in the eyes of many, and it's negatively a very important example. Okay, so on a practical level, if you're dealing with someone who is an honor-based person, the way to make an enemy of them fast is to publicly dishonor them. Okay, it's almost impossible to recover from that. You're in a meeting. Okay, if you're a pastor, so you have your session. You're in a session meeting. Teacher, you're in a faculty meeting, you're just in a meeting where there's some sort of governance at stake. If you are dealing with someone who is an honor-based person and you undermine their honor publicly, good luck. This is not going to be an ally of yours down the road. You cannot do that if you want to then work with them down the road. Because then what you'll end up doing is you undermine their honor and then you make a fact-based appeal to them. Well, they're not listening to any of that. They know that you are now an enemy because you have destroyed their honor, and especially if that's done publicly, it's fatal. So,
I know, like I work at a healthcare company, and I know that my CEO is very rational. And if I ever stand up to him in like a meeting, he's like, "Thank you, Sam." And he'll actually, he's not really run on honor. He's really all about the facts, and that's helpful. But yeah, there's some CEOs who are larger than life. They really want to be spirited and run on honor. Where if you cut that, it doesn't matter how rational your argument is, you lost. So some people, you
get it.
I'm seeing these cases.
So hopefully everyone's seeing those connections. I mean, I'm sure as you think through some interactions you've had, you'll see this over and over. Man, that really didn't go very well. I wonder what happened. Oh, yeah, I questioned that person's honor in front of everyone. You know what I mean? And then all of a sudden, the next meeting, they weren't on my side. Wonder what happened? Well, maybe that. But you're right. You can also be dealing with somebody who's very rational. It's like, hey, I don't care about that. Let's get past that. I want to know the numbers. Don't compliment me. Don't make me feel good in front of it. I don't want that. I want to know the numbers. So we're not, this isn't a business management course, but hopefully you can see how at a very basic level and practical level, some of this is just very, very useful. I personally have found it useful at times. Mostly I find it useful having messed something up terribly, just looking back on it and being like, that's what I did wrong. It's not usually that I get it right. I just kind of look back and like, that's why that went horribly wrong. Okay, I see now. Worked for people at various times who were very honor-based and at times made the mistake of challenging that and then found this is not going well in other areas. Well, that's probably why. Any other thoughts or comments about any of this? Hopefully some of this is helpful just practically to you as well. You ready to turn to Song of Roland? Okay, well, let's shut Beowulf. We'll come back to him. We can reference Beowulf plenty as we go along, but we're going to transition now to discussing the Song of Roland. How did you find this work? This is, I want to say, the shortest complete work I asked you to read. I mean, this is a smallish book, isn't it? How did you find it as a read?
I thought it was really tough because of the rhyming bit.
Yeah.
It got a little okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
I like rhymes and I like that, but I think it felt forced on some places, but because it's so long, it's like you can't really get around that.
There will be multiple times as I read you specific passages where I will get the rhyme wrong, and you'll see my face kind of turn a little red, and I'll just kind of try to carry on. It's a bit hard. It's if you're having trouble reading it yourself, reading it out loud at times is difficult. It takes a lot of practice.
I like the metered aspect.
It is metered, so it's very nice. So this translation that I asked you to read is a translation by Dorothy Sayers. I imagine most of you are familiar with her. She's a friend of C.S. Lewis's. She's one of the first, if not the very first women to receive some sort of advanced degree from either Oxford or Cambridge in the UK. So she's in some ways at the forefront of female academic scholarship in the English-speaking world, which I think is wonderful. She is a brilliant scholar, and you will do yourself a favor at some point down the road if you want to know a lot more about the Song of Roland, simply to read her introduction at the beginning of this book. It's a really delightful introduction. She has a lot of just really insightful comments about this period, because this period, like Beowulf, is very foreign to us in many ways, is it not? I mean, this is a period of chivalry in the Middle Ages, a period that is driven by a code of honor, of knightly honor and valor, which just looks very different from our own. So do yourself a favor at some point and read her introduction, and you'll find all sorts of wonderful little tidbits. The one that sticks out to me is she makes this comment, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something to the effect of, she comments on the fact that so many of the men in Roland do things like weeping and fainting. They'll even fall to the ground in a faint. And she says, you know, this is a different idea of virility, a different idea of manhood. She says, you know, the contemporary British man, when the worst tragedy strikes, sort of throws his cigarette into the fireplace and goes, oh, you know. And she says, these men weep, they faint, they're dramatic, and there's no stigma attached to that. So again, read the introduction sometime, and you'll find some wonderful things there from Dorothy Sayers. I find it to be as readable an English translation as you're going to get. So it can be a little bit difficult at points, but it's as close to a readable translation as we're going to have. Let's talk a little bit about the setup and the background for this. So what is Roland about? And there's one battle in particular that Roland is all about. What is that?
The big thing would be jealousy of his, is it father or father-in-law?
So, yes. Okay, so there's jealousy, which is driving a lot of the action on the part of a man named Ganelon. We'll talk about in a little bit. But the event itself that's kind of at the core was actually probably a historical event, which was at the end of towards the end of the 8th century, so late 700s. I think the date was 777 or thereabouts, so end of the 800s. There was a small contingent of soldiers in Charlemagne's army who were ambushed and defeated. The stories differ, but one of the stories about it was that they were ambushed and defeated by a Muslim army, a Spanish Muslim army. Now, to understand this, you have to understand a little bit about the Muslim conquest. So when the Islamic armies moved from the east into the west, they took Egypt, they took North Africa, and they took most of Spain. The Muslim armies were only defeated and turned back at a battle at a place called Tours. If you've heard of the Battle of Tours, Friedrich Nietzsche called the Battle of Tours the worst event in world history because it's the day Christianity survived. That's Nietzsche for you. But the Battle of Tours is a battle where the Muslim armies were turned back by Charles Martel. I'd love to name one of my sons with Martel. It means the hammer. Okay, Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. But what you have now is a Christian emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, who spends much of his life both expanding his kingdoms from what is modern-day France and parts of Germany, into non-Christian regions of Germany, people called the Saxons, perhaps cousins of our Beowulf people when they were pagans. He expands his armies east into the Saxon regions and forcibly converts them. Charlemagne was the kind of leader who didn't really brook a lot of opposition, so he would go into a Saxon territory. He would command all of the men to be publicly baptized, failing which they would be either beheaded or drowned. Okay? He just didn't, it was a very just kind of perfunctory sort of thing. You're baptized or you're beheaded. And he forcibly converted a great number of Saxons to Christianity that way. He also, at times, was fighting against Muslim armies to his south in Spain. So Roland is premised on a battle that took place during Charlemagne's reign at the end of the 8th century, in which a small contingent of Charlemagne's men were ambushed. It was a skirmish, okay? As best we know, the battle itself involved a very, very small number of men. It was a minor skirmish. It's hardly referenced in the historical sources. It's not interpreted to be a massive battle. But over hundreds of years, the battle and the story of the battle gets told and retold and retold in songs, okay? And what comes of that is what we have in front of us, which is the Song of Roland. I'm tempted at this point to tell you what it sounds like in French, but my French accent sounds like an American at McDonald's trying to order in French. It's bad. It's bad. When I took French in Paris a number of years ago, my family and I lived in Paris for a summer, and when I was taking French, I would be called on in the class to speak in French, and the teacher would always kind of like look away in embarrassment while I was speaking, and then she'd say, well, it could improve, you know, it's pretty hopeless. So I won't say it in French, but it means song, okay? The French word is a song. It's a tale that's told by a bard or a singer of some kind, and as it gets told and told and told, it gets more and more knightly and more chivalrous, and there are greater and greater stakes. It gets told for hundreds of years. The form that we have is completed probably in the 11th century, okay? So do you see that gap? The event happens at the end of the 8th century. This is completed sometime maybe towards the end of the 11th century. It's hundreds of years. And in that period, certain things happen. Charlemagne, the Roman emperor, or the Holy Roman Emperor, goes from being a tall man to being a giant. You saw the descriptions of him. He's giant. He has long, flowing white hair. Okay, he takes on these proportions that are larger than life. And in the telling of this song, he has this ageless dimension to him. He's reported to be almost 200 years old. Okay, so as the song is told and told and told, it moves. This event moves from a minor skirmish to a grand battle involving Charlemagne's finest. Now we don't know all the reasons for why the song expanded and grew like that. Certainly there are tensions between Muslims and Christians. The Crusades are ultimately launched against the Muslims in the Holy Land, starting in 1095 when Pope Urban II launches the First Crusade at Clermont. You know the famous story that he launches the crusade with Deus Vult, God wills it, and commands the Christian armies to go and fight the Muslims. So if this is being completed around the end of the 11th century, it's right around the time that the Crusades are starting. Okay? So what you want to see in the evolution of this story is an evolution of a minor skirmish between possibly Christian and Muslim armies that was largely unremarked on. And over hundreds of years, it becomes a symbol of this great battle between two cultures and civilizations and religions. The true faith of Christianity is up against Islam. Okay? Does that make sense? So if you're thinking of the setting, that's what we're looking at. The epic proportions of this, the grand proportions of this, are due to the fact that the teller of these tales wants you to see that the fate of Christianity is at stake and kind of hangs in the balance in this battle. Now, a little bit more about the context. This is the age of chivalry. Now, what does chivalry mean to you? Most people, it means just getting the door if a lady's going through, right? You know, you say chivalry's not dead or something like that, then hopefully you get smacked. No, I'm just kidding, right? But most of us think of chivalry in a kind of crass way like that. Chivalry has as its root the French word cheval, which means horse. The chivalric knight is the knight who can own a horse. The cost of a war horse would be the equivalent of buying a tank. This is something that happened to me shortly after we got back from Scotland. You know, Scotland is a very, very tiny country. Nobody owns guns. You know, it's a very kind of peaceable context. None of the police officers carry guns. You know, if a police officer walks by you on the street, they're not carrying a gun. Very different context. We came back, and about 2 weeks after coming back to Fort Lauderdale, we were driving down the road, and off to the side of the road was a giant American tank of some kind. I don't know if there had been a parade or what. My boys were up, you know, they're like, there's a tank. They were so excited. I'm like, we are not in Scotland anymore. There's a tank on the side of the street. A war horse, the stallion that a knight rides, would be the cost of a modern day tank. Okay? Now, how many of us could buy a tank? Probably not many. So what are we talking about when we talk about the rules of chivalry? We're talking about the rules of the elite, the upper crust of society, who have the financial wherewithal to buy this medieval tank, this war horse. The codes that govern the chivalric person, the codes of chivalry, are in force only for them in relation to each other. Okay, so it's not as if a peasant gets treated with the rules of chivalry. The vast majority of European society living under chivalry is kind of left to its own devices. The rules of chivalry apply to those who are at the top, who own these war horses. A little bit more about that kind of society, which I think will give us a window into some of what we see happening in Roland. It is a very honor-based society. It is often known as the feudal age. You recognize what I'm speaking of when I say the feudal age. It is an age of mutual agreement between lords and subjects. A lord, and usually someone who is at the very top, okay, so a knight, someone who's able to afford the horse and all that goes with that war horse, is in a promissory, a bonded relationship with those beneath him. Often these relationships are set out in a mode that would look a bit like a wedding ceremony. So a lord who typically owns the land engages in a ceremony in which his fiefs, those beneath him, swear loyalty to him, and he swears loyalty to them. This is early medieval society for you. So a lord promises to protect his subjects. If someone invades their territory, he will raise an army and defend them. The subjects promise to fight for the lord. When the lord calls, they leave their land and they go and they fight. Now these promissory relationships, these liege lords who enter into these relationships with their fiefs, often do so in a very elaborate way so it would be memorable to everyone around. There would be a public ceremony in which the lord promises to be a good and true lord to his subject, and the subject promises to be a good and true subject to the lord. The anecdotal evidence suggests that they would do something then to cause people in the crowd to remember it. One of the stories is that a boy's ears would be boxed, so that many years later when he recounted the ringing in his ears, it would go back to the day when that subject had promised to be loyal to the Lord. Okay? It's a very cruel and brutal society. Beats, the written contract. Right? Public ceremony in which the Lord promises to be a good Lord, the subject promises to be a good subject, and that is an unbreakable covenant now. The ultimate betrayal would be for a subject to go and fight for another lord. Okay? This is a warlike society. So for a subject to break that bond and go and fight for another lord would be the ultimate betrayal. I'll pause there. Does that make sense so far in terms of what feudal society would look like? Mutual relationships, lords and subjects in a tight bond with each other. That's going to give us a window into, I think, understanding a bit more of what's going to happen in Roland. Anything else you think of if you think of early feudal society? I mean, medieval society. What else do you think of? Probably think of Arthur and his court, right? You think of jousts. You think of an intense kind of masculinity. Some of that is actually much later than the period we're looking at, as later periods kind of tried to remember what that was like and keep it alive. Jousting, for instance, is probably much later than this period. But those are the kind of things that come up when we think of this. A very honor-based society where you prove your loyalty to a lord by fighting well under him.
Broward County has a Renaissance festival.
Oh, really? Okay. I didn't know that.
And I remember, I've only been there once, but it was with the kids. Some of the kids were, it was a school thing, chaperoning, that kind of thing. But everybody is dressed in the costumes and so forth, and they have games and contests and jousting. And it's an interesting scenario.
It is.
It's going on right now.
Is it really? Okay.
March 24th.
Well, hurry.
Quiet Waters Park.
That's awesome. I know Quiet Waters Park. That's really cool. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like that would be something your boys would really take to.
Oh, they're all into knights right now.
Yeah.
Knights and armor. And, oh man, they would love that. That'd be great. Well, thanks for mentioning that. I wasn't aware of that at all. Yeah, it's a culture in which women are often on the periphery, and I think that needs to be noted. The bravery of a knight is often to earn the respect and perhaps love of a woman, but this is a warlike culture in which what counts is being able to get up on that war horse and charge straight at the enemy. I was saying during the break earlier to someone who was here earlier, that I always imagine myself in this context, going into some sort of single combat and then falling off the horse, getting dragged behind the horse, to my death. I don't think I would have done very well in this world, but this is a world in which you show your bravery by going into combat and fighting hard and fighting well, and we're going to see that with these characters. We've been going for quite some time now, so let's pause there for just about 5 minutes to take a quick bathroom break. And then when we come back, we'll go to lunchtime on Roland. We'll probably pick up with Roland after lunch.
for. That's pretty entertaining.
I want to check it out now.
But it's like 10 o'clock on a Thursday, so you have to be prepared to be committed to get there at 9:30 and be there a while. Let's see. Yeah, I think they're just called Hootenanny, but
Hootenanny.
There's
a word I haven't heard in
but
forever.
it's pretty entertaining.
Hootenanny. What is a hootenanny? Is it a party or something?
I think it's the name of the band that just shows up.
No, but I mean like we're gonna have a hootenanny. Doesn't that sound like?
But it's
Like
Florida dressed guys playing Irish music.
Gotcha.
Sorry. Can you identify where this is? This is where they drop the books.
Yes. I think I know, actually. Can we hold off for 1 second? We've had this package that we're trying to track down, so let me see if, sorry to keep everyone here. But Sam sent some books here, and I think I know where they dropped them.
Whoever delivered it took a picture, and it's like...
Here, come with me for a second, and let's see if we can find it. Hi. Good, how are you doing?
Do you know who's on security today?
No.
Don't, is it Pete? I know Pete is usually here.
Pete is usually
Yeah,
here.
is he not?
I don't know. I don't know.
Can I help with something? Is everything okay?
No, it's just there was somebody earlier on security that had a weird encounter with one of my parents. It was very odd, so I just want to make sure
Not good.
it's cleared up. I got
So
a
these
phone
books he was
interview,
supposed to have read for
the
class?
best volunteer.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I'm trying to think. Is it the other end? So I'll go through here. This person was looking for somebody on security. Do you know, Doug, where we could tell her to go to find someone?
No,
It's the other end.
It's like the other end, because I saw other end.
I'll take you through. Here, I'll take you through. And so
I just went by the office.
you did. She's looking for security, and I said I don't know.
Yeah, don't.
You're like, I feel bad. I told them about the beach. They couldn't go, and I said, you guys had to go
We'll be
out.
right back, Doug.
It's
Sorry
okay,
about that.
I thought, but
I
part
bet
of it
you
is,
this building is
well,
It's different when you're not like with your family.
this
Right,
building
exactly.
in the 60s and early 70s. And so there's a mirror. It's almost like there's that
but
there,
if you go to
that's
the
exactly
pier,
like this
even
right
if you
here.
went to the pier that's straight off.
You'd think that it was on that end. Here. Let's hope it's down
You see
here.
it Hillsborough and like the
So,
the White
don't
House.
worry about it.
So I didn't know if you guys were gonna go for your run and then,
Yeah, I don't know. But maybe.
but if you went today after class, you'd be fine.
It is spring break, so.
Yeah.
That's what I was telling them yesterday, like, just be mindful of where you go on the beach. Cause I mean, you've got the whole week off of school and yet here you are.
Yeah, this is my vacation right here.
Yeah, right. Good job.
And you chose to freeze inside of a classroom and not go to the beach yourself.
Would never go to the beach here.
No? Oh yeah, that's right.
Sorry about that, guys.
You're in Colorado now. Did you find
It wasn't at the other end either, Doug, so Sam's gonna run up and ask Lori. It looked like it was on
Yeah.
outside side.
Yeah, right outside one of the doors.
The mystery package.
Right?
Yeah, the security guy brought it in when he found it or something.
Yeah. Ready when you are, okay? I mentioned that we would show a short clip that seems to be somewhat similar to the ending of Beowulf. So this comes from The Lord of the Rings. We'll just watch this together real quick before we jump into the song of Roland and Ernest. It's there you go. So kind of similar, huh?
Is that a deleted scene? I mean, yeah.
I think it is deleted.
Okay.
Last time I saw the whole version of it, I don't remember seeing it in there. So I think it is deleted from the regular version of that. So let's look at Roland together. We'll see how far we can get by lunchtime, and we'll probably end up picking up a bit with a bit of Roland left to do after lunch. Does the mystery continue? Do we have our package?
Mystery continues.
No. Okay. All right. So let's look together at the beginning of Roland. As we said, this is a story that grows over time, but we're going to meet Count Roland, and we're going to meet Charlemagne at the very opening of this song. So turn to the opening of the book, which will, for you, if you have the Sayers translation, be page 51. Carlon the king, our emperor Charlemagne, full 7 years, has been abroad in Spain. He's won the highlands as far as to the main. No castle more can stand before his face. City nor wall is left for him to break, save Saragossa in its high mountain place. Marsilian holds it, the king who hates God's name. Mahound he serves and to Apollyon prays. He'll not escape the ruin that awaits. Well, let's pause there for a minute. In the opening paragraph there, in the opening lines, we're learning something about what Roland and company thought about their Muslim opponents. And this may be something that struck you when you read this, but Roland and company are Christians who believe that they are fighting against a religion which is also a trinity. Did you pick up on this? Marsilian, the Muslim king, the king who hates God's name, Mahound he serves, and to Apollyon prays. He'll not escape the ruin that awaits. Now, we don't know all the details about this, but Christian-Muslim relations, let's just say, weren't at their height at this point. And men like Roland believed that the people they were fighting were a mirror image of themselves. And it made sense to them that Islam would have also been a trinity of sorts. What kind of trinity? Well, Apollyon, Mahound, meaning Muhammad, and Allah. Okay? So, I mean, one of the things that we can learn from that very quickly is it's always good to know what you're fighting. Roland and company don't even know what they're up against. They're convinced that Islam is an evil religion, but their belief is that Islam is actually a trinity. And you don't have to be a scholar in world religions to know that if there's one thing that Islam is not, it would be a trinity, right? I mean, it's the central declaration of Islam, which is that God is one, set against other religions who might be what they perceive to be polytheistic, okay? So there's a profound misunderstanding at the heart of Roland and company when it comes to what exactly they're fighting. You can take that and run with it as you like in terms of the lessons that can be gleaned from that. But let's move on. Marsilian sat in Saragossa town. He sought an orchard where shade was to be found. On a bright days of marble he lies down. By 20,000 his vassals stand around. He calls before him all his dukes and his counts. Listen, my lords, what affliction... Excuse me. I find no force, his force is for to flout. You say that fast one time. I find no force, his force is for to flout. It's like one of those tongue twisters. Peter picked a peck of pickled peppers kind of thing. Wise men of wit, give counsel to me now. Save me from death and loss of my renown. There's ne'er a paynim, a word for a Muslim. Paynim, like pagan or Muslim, okay? They think in broad categories, let's be honest, okay? There's ne'er a payman utters a single sound. We need to pause here. We'll just pause here, it's okay. I'm wondering if this is the mystery package.
Looks like it.
Nice. Victory. I feel like this has been an epic journey.
Right?
Yeah, it's my wife.
Ulysses proportions.
What's that?
Of Ulyssean proportions.
That's right. Now, as the ring giver, you have to share.
Come to me when
Thank you, Doug. Sorry. Well, glad we found that. You want to take a minute to open it up? You're going to be tearing it open, and you're it's kind of like opening that candy wrapper in church when everybody's kind of sitting and listening. Glad you finally got those, Sam. And Roland was in there, huh?
Yeah.
So, good. Okay. Well, now we can really begin in earnest. A couple things about Marsilian. He sought an orchard where shade was to be found. There's a long tradition of Christian and Western thought about Islam in the East, and all sorts of stories, as you can imagine, have been told about people who live in the East or people who are Muslim, and here we have a bit of a stereotype, don't we? Okay, the Muslim king is going to hold court, so what does he do? He finds an orchard. The garden and the East are very closely related ideas, right? That Eastern monarchs kind of stroll through a garden. And here we have the Muslim king who finds an orchard, sits under the shade, and then holds his counsel. So he's set up in a very stereotypical way. This is, if someone were to ask, well, what would a Muslim king look like and do, this would be the stereotype in this period. Skip a few pages over. The war council is at a loss as to exactly what to do. Charlemagne seems to be traveling through Marsilian's territory, which is probably much of modern-day Spain, and Marsilian is at a loss as to whether to sue for peace or to fight Charlemagne. He decides finally to sue for peace. Page 54. Section 6. Marsil the king, his conference had ceased. Now, why is he sometimes called Marsilian, and why is he called Marsil in other cases? To confuse you. Also, because it helps the line at times. Okay, we talked about the meter, but just be aware that sometimes these names feel like they're changing on us. So Charlemagne, Carlon. Those are the kinds of things that are going to change. It's the same name, but either shortened or abbreviated. Marsil the king, his conference had ceased. He tells his men, my barons, go with speed. Bear in your hands boughs of the olive tree. On my behalf, King Charlemagne beseech, for his God's sake, to show me clemency. Say this month's end in truth he shall not see, ere I shall seek him with 1,000 vessels leal. The law of Christ I'll then and there receive. In faith and love I will his liegeman be. I'll send him sureties if thus he shall decree. Quoth Blancandrin, one of his knights or one of his soldiers, be sure he'll grant your plea. What Marsilian here is doing in promising to swear to be Charlemagne's liege lord is to enter into this feudal relationship with him. Remember we talked about the Lord and the subject? Marsilion is suing for peace, and the way to do that at this time is to promise to be a subject to a greater king. Okay? Turn to the next page. Let's actually go to the bottom of the same page instead. So bottom of page 54. The Emperor Charles is glad and full of cheer. Charles Magnus, Charlemagne, Charles. Okay, the Emperor Charles is glad and full of cheer. Cordova's taken, the outer walls are pierced. His catapults have cast the towers down sheer. Rich booty's gone to all his chevaliers. Silver and gold and goodly battle gear. Let's look at a description of Charlemagne in the middle of the next page. So right smack dab in the middle of the page before section 9. Of fairest France there sits the king austere. White are his locks and silver is his beard. His body noble, his countenance severe. If any seek him, no need to say, lo here. From off their steeds let down the messengers. Well do they greet him with shows of love sincere. Isn't that a brilliant description? His locks are white and silver is his beard. And if everybody wants to find him, no need to say, lo here. Okay? He sticks out. You're not wondering where Charlemagne is. Charlemagne is seen as the emperor who reconstitutes Rome in Europe. Later ages will think of him as the Holy Roman Emperor, the founder of the empire that goes on to be called the Holy Roman Empire. It's been quipped many times. I think it was first in the 19th century, but there's this quip that I'm sure you've heard. A couple of you are smiling about this, that the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, was not Roman, and was not an empire. But in any event, Charlemagne goes down in history as the first of these kings who's kind of brought order back to Europe. Charles the Great, Charles Magnus. One of the things that we know about Charlemagne that I like is that when he would have his meals, he would have his Augustan read to him. He would have City of God in particular brought in and read to him while he ate. It's read to him because he probably can't read very well himself, nor could most of his subjects. Charlemagne could make a very good mark when he signed his name. That's the state of things. If you're wondering why there's not a whole lot of theological sophistication, well, there wasn't a whole lot of reading either. Before them all, Blancandrin forward stood. So Blancandrin is going to be one of the emissaries of the Muslim king, and hailed the king. God give his grace to you, the glorious king to whom worship is due. Thus speaks the king, Marsilian, great in rule. Much hath he studied the saving faith and true. Now of his wealth he would send you in sooth lions and bears, leashed greyhounds, not a few, 700 camels, 1,000 falcons mewed, and gold and silver borne on 400 mules, a wagon train of 50 carts to boot, and store enough of golden bezants good, wherewith to pay your soldiers as you should. Too long you've stayed in this land to our route, ere in France return you at your suit. Thither my liege will surely follow you, and will become your man in faith and true, and at your hand hold all his realm in few. With lifted hands to God the emperor sues, then bows his head and so begins to brood. What Marsilian's emissary is doing here is he is appearing to Charlemagne and submitting himself by proxy for his emperor to Charlemagne's rule. He's surrendering, if you will, but the form that the surrender takes is to make himself a subject of Charlemagne. Okay? Section 10, middle of page 56. The emperor bode long time with downcast eyes. He was a man not hasty in reply, but wont to speak only when well advised. Next page, middle of the page, he takes counsel. So right in the middle of the page in section 11. Beneath a pine straightway the king is gone, and calls his barons to counsel thereupon. By French advice, whate'er he does is done. We're going to meet Roland on the next page, and let's meet Roland and then break for lunch. Okay, so section 14 on the next page, 58. The Emperor Charles had finished all his speech. See down at the bottom of the page? The Emperor Charles had finished all his speech. The county Roland, who fiercely disagrees, swift to oppose, springs up upon his feet. He tells the king, never more trust Marsile. Now, let's pause there. Roland Springs, he fiercely disagrees. He's a hero, isn't he? Think of people like Achilles who spring and rush and jump. Think of people like Beowulf who dive. This is a man of action. He doesn't say, well, that has some truth to it. There's also over here something else that I would suggest that you look at. I mean, they're wrong and I'm right. Nevermore trust Marsil. 7 years long in land of Spain we've been. Won for you both nopals and comobiles. I took Valterna, the land of pine I seized, and Balagate, and Seville, and Tudile. Then wrought Marsil a very treacherous deed. He sent his paynims by number of 15, all of them bearing boughs of the olive tree, and with like words he sued to you for peace. Then did you ask the French lords for their rede? Foolish advice they gave to you indeed. You sent the paynim to counts of your menie, that's household. Basan was one, the other was Basile. He smote their heads off in hills beneath Haltil. This war you've started wage on and make no cease. To Saragossa lead your host in the field. Spend all your life, if need be, in the siege. Revenge the men this villain made to bleed. Now this is a very honorable appeal, isn't it? Revenge, show vengeance. Why? Because this king has already sued you for peace in the past. And when he did, you sent emissaries to him and he chopped their heads off. Don't trust him. There's some truth to what Roland is saying, isn't there? And this isn't a very trustworthy king we're dealing with. I hope that we've gotten a flavor for Roland's character. He springs, he disagrees fiercely, he is a doer. He acts based on honor. His counsel is driven by the fact that he perceives Marsilian, the Muslim king, to be a dishonorable man. Okay? With that, let's conclude until after lunch. When we come back, we'll finish Roland and we'll talk about Don Quixote. What did you guys think about Don Quixote, by the way?
I read it in Spanish.
Did you really? That's awesome.
I know.
Hey,
I couldn't find the right translation because
that is amazing.
Most of them I got from the library, and I couldn't find it, so I talked to one of my I sent an email to all of my Spanish speaking co-workers who were teaching Spanish. I was like, do you happen to have a copy? And they were like, we only have book one. I was like, I'll take it.
I wish you had told me that in advance of the class, because I have spent so much time trying to find a good translation of Don Quixote. The Edith Grossman translation is brilliant from an English standpoint.
Yeah.
I would be fascinated though by how loyal it is to the Spanish.
Yeah, it's still hard.
So like there's a tradition of interpreting Cervantes' Don Quixote and taking out all of the humor. So early English translators would actually tamper with the text when they translated it to take out all of the improper grammar, because it was meant initially to be funny. You know, there'd be disagreement between subject and verb and things like that, and the English translators would like iron that out. Yeah. But anyway, I wasn't thinking that you would read it in Spanish. That's brilliant. I wish I'd known that.
It was easier to read in